Hey guys, for a period so often dressed in candlelight, polished manners, and elegant dance cards, Regency England could be an unexpectedly cold, noisy, uncomfortable place to get through an ordinary day. Behind the silk gloves and carefully worded invitations was a world of damp rooms, unreliable food, relentless social pressure, and daily routines that made even comfort feel like work. Let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which corner of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like is a lovely way to support the channel. And do subscribe if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past. Now, to understand what everyday life was really like in Regency England, it helps to step away from the ballroom almost at once. The Regency, usually dated from 1811 to 1820 in the formal political sense, is often imagined through a very narrow lens. Modern viewers tend to picture drawing rooms, country estates, polished silver, and well-spoken people gliding through lives of controlled elegance. Some of that image is not entirely false. There was refinement, there was fashion, there were rituals of politeness so elaborate that an entire day might be shaped by them. But the deeper truth is that daily life in Regency England was governed not simply by grace, but by constraint. Climate, class, money, smell, illness, fuel, mud, servants, debts, reputation, and distance all press themselves into the smallest domestic moments. That is what makes the period interesting, not just what people wore or how they danced, but why ordinary existence so often felt less luxurious than the image it later acquired. The point is not to strip away all romance, only to see what the romance was built on, and what it cost the people trying to maintain it. For most people, of course, the Regency was not a sequence of elegant visits or musical evenings. It was labor, it was making do, it was uncertainty about rent, bread, work, weather, and the price of fuel. Even among the respectable middling classes, daily life could be far more fragile than the polished surfaces suggested. A family might appear orderly and dignified while living in constant quiet anxiety over bills, prospects, and social standing. To look composed was one thing, to be secure was another. Mourning began early by modern standards, though not always for the reasons people might expect. Houses were colder than we often imagine. Even wealthy homes were difficult to heat evenly, and the first experience of the day in cooler months could be a blunt encounter with cold air, chilly wash water, and rooms that had not yet been brought to life by fires. The architecture of fine houses can give the impression of comfort, but large Georgian and Regency interiors were often drafty. Heat gathered near the fire and vanished almost immediately into corridors, stairwells, and high-ceilinged rooms. Comfort was local, not general. You were warm by the fire, not in the house. That small fact shaped a surprising amount of daily behavior. People clustered around fireplaces, chose rooms according to light and temperature, shut doors constantly, and judged whether not as a background condition but as a practical force. A cold week could alter mood, schedule, laundry, travel, and appetite. A damp spell might creep into bedding, clothes, and stored food. Winter darkness lengthened domestic life in a way modern electric light makes difficult to feel. Candlelight was softer, certainly, but also dimmer, dearer, and more limiting. Even the wealthy thought about the cost of illumination. Then there was washing, which in period dramas can look restrained and graceful, but in reality was often partial, strategic, and governed by effort. Full immersion bathing was not unknown, and attitudes toward cleanliness were changing. But the routine most common in ordinary respectable households was the washstand, the basin, the jug, and the cloth. Water had to be carried, heated, poured, and managed. Privacy might be limited. The process was slower and more deliberate than the modern idea of simply becoming clean. Hair added another complication. It needed brushing, arranging, and controlling, and while Regency fashion moved away from the towering powdered styles of the late 18th century, personal grooming still required time, assistance, and patience. Clothing, too, looked lighter than it felt. Regency dress is often remembered for its simplicity compared with the enormous skirts and rigid structures of earlier decades. And in some ways that is true. Women's fashion shifted toward high waistlines and softer silhouettes, inspired partly by classical forms. Yet these garments still required underlayers, careful laundering, mending, and social awareness. Fine white muslin, so associated with the era, was beautiful but impractical in a very literal sense. It showed dirt quickly. It wrinkled. It needed maintenance. A dress that seemed effortless on the page or in portraiture was, in everyday life, another object demanding attention. Men's clothing had its own discipline. Tailoring mattered intensely. A gentleman's coat, breeches or trousers, cravat, boots, gloves, and linen signaled not just taste but control. To appear careless was often to appear suspect. The Regency male ideal, especially in fashionable circles, was less rugged than exact. Clean lines, proper fit, polished boots, a correctly tied cravat. These things were part of a language others could read instantly. And like all such languages, it was exhausting for those who could not easily afford fluency. Breakfast, despite the comforting associations the word now carries, varied sharply by class. In prosperous households it might include tea or coffee, bread, butter, eggs, perhaps cold meats, maybe hot dishes depending on the household's habits and means. But food in Regency England was never detached from systems of supply, season, and cost. Bread prices mattered politically and personally. Tea had become deeply embedded in daily life, yet remained tied to empire, trade, and expense. Sugar, too, that quiet companion of domestic comfort, belonged to a global system of exploitation that sat invisibly on the breakfast table. One of the strange truths of the period is that a calm domestic ritual in England could depend upon violence and forced labor an ocean away. For poorer households, meals were narrower, more repetitive, and more anxious. Bread, porridge, cheese when possible, scraps, weak tea if affordable, small economies repeated day after day. Hunger did not always appear as outright famine. More often it appeared as monotony, insufficiency, and the constant mental arithmetic of stretching food. A working family might know exactly how quickly a loaf disappeared, how long dripping could be saved, how much coal remained, how many days stood between them and pay. And outside the home, England was not neat. This is one of the most important corrections to the polished Regency image. Streets in towns and cities were often filthy. Mud, dung, refuse, animal remains, smoke, spilled waste, stagnant water, and overcrowding shaped the urban experience. Even in respectable districts, cleanliness was relative. In poorer areas, the sensory burden was constant. Walking through a street meant navigating not only traffic and weather but smell. Horses powered transport, and horses produced enormous amounts of waste. There was no separating elegance from this. The carriage, however fine, moved through the same material reality. London, in particular, was a place of astonishing contrast. It offered luxury, spectacle, politics, shopping, music, booksellers, clubs, parks, and ambition on a scale unmatched in Britain. But it was also loud, dangerous, unequal, and physically oppressive. The same city that displayed exquisite goods in shop windows contained debtors, beggars, exhausted servants, prostitutes, street sellers, and children working through hunger and cold. The Regency capital was vibrant, but not gentle, and that contrast ran straight through domestic service, which is often romanticized as part of the smooth functioning of great houses. Servants made gentility possible, but their own days were full of repetition, hierarchy, and fatigue. Fires lit, water carried, chamber pots emptied, clothes brushed, boots cleaned, meals prepared, bells answered, beds aired, carpets beaten, silver polished, errands run. A household that appeared serene from the perspective of its owners could feel relentless below stairs. The illusion of effortless order was built from hidden movement. That hidden movement mattered socially as well. In Regency England, class was not only about money. It was about who did visible labor, who avoided it, and who could afford to have discomfort quietly absorbed by other people. A warm room existed because someone rose earlier to light it. Clean linen appeared because someone washed, dried, ironed, and mended it. Dinner arrived because kitchens, sculleries, and service passages had been active for hours. If modern viewers sometimes find the period graceful, it is worth remembering that its grace was often a managed surface stretched over an immense amount of work. There was another discomfort too, one harder to photograph and easier to miss. Reputation. Daily life for the respectable classes, especially women, was shaped by observation. Conduct was never entirely private. Visits had meanings. Invitations had meanings. Walking out, receiving callers, replying to letters, choosing acquaintances, even lingering too long in one company could acquire significance. The famous elegance of Regency manners was not simply decorative. It was defensive. It helped people move through a world in which small missteps could produce lasting consequences. That social pressure could make even leisure feel structured. To visit was not merely to enjoy conversation. It was to maintain networks, signal belonging, avoid insult, manage obligations, and measure subtle shifts in status. Much of life was choreographed because reputation was a form of practical security. Marriage prospects, financial support, patronage, friendship, and family honor all rested on impressions that had to be continually maintained. In that sense, Regency politeness was less a charming extra than a kind of social equipment. And yet, to stop there would be misleading because daily life was not only oppressive or gray. People also found pleasure, and often in forms that now seem modest. Reading by the fire, music in the evening, a walk when the weather held, tea with a familiar friend, a new ribbon, a circulating library novel, a letter arriving at last, a room briefly warm enough to be comfortable. One reason the period still draws people in is that its pleasures were so tangible. They had texture. They were earned against inconvenience. That, perhaps, is the quiet twist at the center of Regency life. Its world of refinement was real, but precisely because life was uncomfortable enough for refinement to matter. Manners mattered because friction was everywhere. Beauty mattered because the environment so often was not beautiful. A well-run household mattered because disorder was always close. Even fashion, for all its vanity, can be read as a small human insistence on elegance in a world of mud, smoke, debt, and uncertainty. And once you begin to see that, the famous image of Regency England starts to shift. The ballroom has not disappeared. It has simply become part of a larger, more honest picture. One that includes the kitchen fire, the freezing corridor, the street outside, and the servant climbing the stairs before dawn. It also raises a more interesting question than whether the age was glamorous. The real question is who was allowed to experience the glamour, how briefly, and at what cost to everyone else. That question becomes even sharper when we leave the household and look at the wider pressures pressing in on Regency life, because this was not only an age of manners and domestic ritual. It was also an age of war, economic strain, and a growing sense that beneath the polished English society was far less stable than it liked to appear. It was also an age of war, economic strain, and a growing sense that beneath the polished English society was far less stable than it liked to appear. The Regency sat inside the long shadow of the Napoleonic Wars, and even those who never saw a battlefield could feel the conflict in prices, taxes, shortages, uncertainty, and the steady presence of military life in the national imagination. A gentleman might speak pleasantly over dinner of books, horses, or politics, but war was never very far away. It shaped careers, fortunes, anxieties, and the rhythms of public life. Newspapers carried reports from the continent. Families waited for letters. Officers moved through towns and drawing rooms with a peculiar mixture of glamour and danger. And the economy, already under pressure from industrial change and bad harvests, remained vulnerable to disruption in ways that made everyday life feel more brittle than the manners of the period suggested. That brittleness was not distributed evenly. The affluent could cushion themselves, at least for a time, with land, investments, servants, and credit. The poor had almost no protection at all. But what is striking about Regency England is how many people in the broad middle lived with a quiet sense of exposure. Respectability was not the same as security. Clergymen with large families, naval widows, retired officers on half-pay, minor professionals, governesses, genteel unmarried women with limited incomes, all occupied a world that looked stable on the outside and was often anything but. A small change in circumstances could be disastrous. An illness, a failed investment, a dead patron, a rise in food prices, a son who did not find employment, a daughter who could not marry advantageously. Any of these might tilt an orderly life into chronic anxiety. This is one reason money occupies such a constant background place in the literature and correspondence of the period. It is not simply greed or social vanity, though those existed too. It is the pressure of living in a society where income determined not only comfort, but honor, options, and future. To modern eyes, it can seem strange that so much emotional energy was tied to inheritances, settlements, dowries, livings, and annuities. But these were not abstract numbers. They shaped where you could live, whom you could marry, whether you could keep servants, what you could eat, whether you could travel, and whether you could remain recognizably respectable at all. For women especially, the limits of the system were woven into daily life. The graceful image of the Regency lady can obscure just how dependent many women were on male relatives, marriage arrangements, or painfully narrow forms of paid work. A woman of genteel background was expected to be accomplished, self-controlled, modest, and socially fluent. She might be educated in music, drawing, French, or household management, but her practical route to long-term security was often marriage. That does not mean every marriage was cynical, nor that affection did not matter. But affection had to live inside a hard economic frame. A woman without fortune might be charming, clever, and well-connected, yet still stand on uncertain ground. A widow might find herself abruptly negotiating with the world from a much weaker position than she had occupied while married. And yet the trap was wider than it first appears, because men, too, were bound by expectations they did not always control. A younger son of a respectable family could not simply drift into a comfortable adult life. He needed a profession, patronage, or money enough to support a household. The church, the law, the navy, the army, medicine, perhaps colonial service, these were among the accepted routes, but each came with barriers, risks, and varying degrees of status. Beneath the confidence of Regency masculinity, there was often a deep fear of inadequacy. To fail publicly, to live beyond one's means, to be seen as idle without the wealth to excuse idleness, was dangerous in a society that valued composure but watched for weakness. Credit, in that world, was both useful and perilous. It helped sustain the appearance of stability. Goods could be ordered, accounts kept, bills delayed. Shopkeepers extended trust to households that seemed sound, and families might go on maintaining a style of life that was, in truth, increasingly unsupported by actual cash. This gave Regency society one of its strangest textures. Surfaces could remain polished long after the finances behind them had begun to crack. A dinner might be well laid, the silver shining, the servants correct, the guests agreeable, while somewhere in the background there existed unpaid accounts, a looming debt, or a terrifying dependence on some future inheritance. Politeness did not merely soften life. Sometimes it concealed collapse. That same tension between appearance and strain could be felt in the design of the day itself. Time in Regency England was not organized by screens, notifications, and constant immediate communication. It moved more slowly, but not always more peacefully. Delays were ordinary. Letters took time. News traveled imperfectly. Arrangements could be upset by weather, road conditions, illness, or simple distance. Waiting was built into life. Yet because waiting was so common, people invested great emotional meaning in correspondence, visits, and arrivals. A letter was not a small event. It could alter the mood of a household. It could bring relief, dread, invitation, obligation, or scandal. The daily post carried a force that now belongs to far more continuous streams of information, but perhaps with less dignity and certainly with less suspense. Domestic interiors themselves reflected this world of managed uncertainty. Even in refined houses, the idea of privacy was more fragile than we might expect. Families lived closely with one another and, if they employed servants, lived closely with them as well, even if social boundaries remained strict. Bedrooms might be shared. Sounds traveled. Doors opened unexpectedly. Servants entered to lay fires, draw curtains, carry hot water, clear dishes, empty pots. A woman dressing for dinner or a man preparing to go out were rarely engaged in entirely private acts unless they were unusually fortunate in space and means. One of the quiet paradoxes of Regency gentility is that people were intensely concerned with dignity while living in conditions that made uninterrupted solitude difficult. Children, too, occupied a somewhat different place from the sentimental ideal later associated with the Victorian nursery. Affection within families was real and often deep, but daily life with children was not always organized around them in the modern way. In wealthier homes, they might spend large stretches of time under the care of nurses, nursery maids, or governesses, joining adults at selected moments rather than living at the center of the household's emotional stage. In poorer households, childhood was even less protected. Children worked, fetched, carried, minded younger siblings, learned endurance early, and lived close to the practical demands of the family economy. The Regency did not invent tenderness toward children, but it remained a society in which usefulness and discipline often carried more weight than innocence. Education reflected class divisions just as sharply. Sons of the prosperous might be sent to school, prepared by tutors, drilled in Latin and Greek, or shaped for university and profession. Daughters were educated more unevenly, often at home or in small schools focused on comportment and accomplishments as much as intellectual development. Among the laboring poor, formal education might be limited or absent altogether. Literacy rates were rising, but unevenly. Reading could be a delight, a discipline, a marker of status, or a practical skill linked to religion and work. The spread of print culture gave the Regency an unusually self-aware quality. People read novels, sermons, newspapers, pamphlets, conduct books, satirical prints, and political arguments. Public opinion was becoming more visible, but not more serene. And if the home was one theater of Regency life, the street and shop were another. Shopping, especially in towns, was becoming more recognizable as a social activity, not merely the acquisition of necessities. Elegant women visited milliners, drapers, and circulating libraries. Men examined gloves, hats, books, snuff, and tailoring. Shop windows became sites of desire and display. But here again, what looks charming at first glance carries a sharper edge underneath. Consumption was becoming an increasingly visible way to signal taste and status, and therefore also a source of pressure. To choose correctly, to appear neither vulgar nor shabby, to keep pace without looking desperate, this required judgment and money. The shop was not just a place of pleasure. It was part of the machinery of social reading. Travel throws this tension into particularly clear relief. The Regency is associated with coaches, posting inns, country visits, and journeys through the English landscape. And there was a kind of drama to travel then that modern convenience has largely removed. The road connected people to the wider nation in a way that felt active and immediate. But it was also uncomfortable, costly, dirty, uncertain, and sometimes frightening. Roads had improved in many regions, thanks to turnpike systems, but even so the experience depended on weather, horses, road quality, daylight, and luck. A journey that sounds picturesque in retrospect could mean jolting discomfort, bad food at inns, stale air, delays, wet luggage, suspicious fellow travelers, and the continual practical problem of getting from one place to another without too much expense or trouble. Private carriages offered greater control, but only to those rich enough to maintain them. Even then, luxury had limits. Carriages broke, wheels stuck, horses needed changing or resting. Winter roads could become nearly impassable. Summer heat brought dust and exhaustion. The body felt travel much more directly. To go any serious distance required endurance. This matters because Regency society depended heavily on movement between London, market towns, naval ports, spas, and country houses. Relationships were shaped by geography in ways that made absence more real and reunion more significant. The famous resorts and seasonal centers of the period reveal another side of everyday life. Places such as Bath, Brighton, Cheltenham, and various spa towns were not simply sites of leisure. They were spaces where health, status, courtship, and display intersected. A family might go to Bath for supposed therapeutic waters, but also for society, introductions, and strategic visibility. One might go to Brighton because the Prince Regent's presence had made it fashionable, turning the seaside into something more than a practical edge of land and weather. Yet these places, too, carried contradictions. A spa town promised health but also gossip, competition, expense, and boredom. Seaside air might be praised as invigorating while guests shivered in rented lodgings or struggled through awkward rituals of bathing and public sociability. Health, in fact, is another of those realities that strips away much of the smoothness from the Regency image. People lived with pain, risk, and uncertainty at levels that modern medicine has made easier to forget. Infections could turn dangerous quickly. Childbirth remained genuinely perilous. Teeth decayed and caused constant misery. Tuberculosis, fevers, digestive complaints, skin conditions, rheumatism, and a host of poorly understood chronic ailments formed part of ordinary life. Medical practice was varied, uneven, and often limited in effectiveness. There were skilled and conscientious practitioners, certainly, but also treatments that now seem misguided or even brutal. Bleeding, purging, blistering, strong emetics, opiates used without modern regulation, all belong to a world in which relief was sought with imperfect tools. This made the management of the body one of the hidden themes of everyday life. Sleep could be poor because bedding was damp, streets were noisy, pain lingered, or anxiety would not settle. Digestion mattered because diet was irregular and medicine unreliable. Teeth mattered because they could transform comfort, speech, and appearance. Women's bodies were watched, managed, and judged through systems of modesty and medical misunderstanding. Men's bodies were expected to appear controlled, upright, and capable even when illness or melancholy pressed hard underneath. In a society so devoted to composure, physical suffering often had to be folded quietly into the day. Food itself, once we move beyond idealized country house tables, becomes another story of imbalance and adaptation. Seasonality governed much more than many modern listeners instinctively feel. Freshness had geography. Urban households depended on supply chains that were active but vulnerable. Preservation techniques mattered. Salted meats, pickling, preserving, drying, brewing, baking, dairy management, all formed part of the practical intelligence of survival and comfort. Wealth could widen choice, but it did not abolish limits. Even a good table depended on servants, weather, transport, and the local economy. And for the poor, bad harvests or rising grain prices could transform the entire moral atmosphere of a community within weeks. Perhaps that is why the Regency can feel so layered when viewed closely. Its elegance was real, but it was always negotiating with discomfort. Its manners were refined, but refinement emerged in part because disorder, vulnerability, and inequality were never far away. A drawing room conversation, a promenade, a neatly folded note, a cup of tea, all these rested on a much rougher material foundation than nostalgia usually allows. The age was not false exactly. It was simply divided against itself, practiced in grace while surrounded by instability. And nowhere did that division become more visible than in the contrast between the expanding culture of improvement and the persistent reality of poverty. Britain in these years was changing. Agricultural methods, commerce, manufacturing, roads, print culture, and urban growth were reshaping the country. People spoke of progress, improvement, cultivation, and taste. But progress did not descend evenly. In rural districts, laborers faced enclosure, wage pressure, and dependence on systems of poor relief that were themselves becoming contentious. In industrial towns, new forms of work created wealth and misery side by side. England was becoming recognizably modern in some ways, yet remained tied to older hierarchies and vulnerabilities in others. For the laboring poor, ordinary life was defined less by elegance than by exhaustion. Days were long, and seasonal rhythms still carried enormous force. Work in the fields, in service, in workshops, in domestic industry, at docks, in mines, on roads, all demanded physical endurance. Clothing wore out. Shoes mattered intensely. Weather could make work punishing or impossible. Housing was often cramped, dark, and unsanitary. A laboring family did not experience the Regency as a series of manners and visits, but as a ceaseless management of effort, food, rent, fuel, and illness. And yet even here, people made worlds for themselves, with customs, neighborliness, religious life, fairs, songs, alehouses, courtships, and local loyalties that gave shape to existence beyond survival alone. Still, the strain in the social order was becoming harder to ignore, especially after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when peace did not bring the simple relief many had hoped for. Demobilization, unemployment, high prices, bad harvests, and political frustration combined into something sharper and more uneasy. The surface rituals of Regency life continued, but underneath them grew a country increasingly aware of grievance, nervous about disorder, and uncertain about what kind of future was arriving. In drawing rooms, this might appear as anxious conversation about reform, unrest, or the dangerous mood of the lower orders. In ordinary communities, it appeared more plainly as hunger, resentment, and a sense that old assurances were weakening. And once that larger pressure enters the picture, even the apparently private routines of the Regency begin to look different. The breakfast table, the servant's bell, the shopping call, the carefully managed visit, the rented lodging in Bath, the coach journey through mud, all were taking place inside a society whose polished self-image was under strain. The domestic world had not become less important. If anything, it became more so, because home was where larger uncertainties were absorbed, disguised, argued over, and lived through day by day. Which is why, to understand everyday life in Regency England fully, we have to look next at how people moved through those social rituals so carefully, and why something as simple as a visit, a dance, or a marriage conversation could carry far more weight than it seemed to on the surface. Which is why, to understand everyday life in Regency England fully, we have to look next at how people moved through those social rituals so carefully, and why something as simple as a visit, a dance, or a marriage conversation could carry far more weight than it seemed to on the surface. In a society where rank was read quickly and futures could turn on impression, social life was not really separate from practical life at all. It was one of the main arenas in which practical life was decided. The drawing room, the assembly room, the dining table, the walk in the park, the call made at the correct hour, the invitation accepted or declined with proper wording, all these belong to a quiet economy of consequence. A morning call, for example, sounds harmless enough to modern ears, almost casual. In the Regency, it was anything but casual, even when it appeared easy. To call upon a family was to acknowledge their place in your social world and to invite acknowledgement in return. The hour mattered. The degree of familiarity mattered. Whether the lady of the house was at home mattered, and even that phrase, at home, had its own social complexity. A family might be physically present and yet not receiving visitors. Cards might be left without a meeting taking place. The servant who opened the door was not merely a domestic worker at that moment, but a gatekeeper within a coded system. To be admitted upstairs, to be told politely that the family was not receiving, to leave one's card and depart. These were small events with social meanings that careful people understood immediately. This can sound excessively delicate until one remembers how few other tools existed for managing relationships among the respectable classes. There was no casual message sent in seconds, no quick correction after a misunderstanding, no easy public informality to flatten embarrassment. Social trust had to be built through repeated gestures, and those gestures acquired weight precisely because they were limited and visible. To neglect a visit, to delay a reply, to omit a name from an invitation list, or to show marked preference in company could all communicate more than anyone wished to say aloud. The era's much-discussed politeness was not merely love of ceremony. It was a system for handling tension without open confrontation, though of course open confrontation still happened, only usually after a great deal had already been signaled indirectly. For women, especially unmarried women of the middling and upper ranks, the social world could feel both narrow and intensely exposed. A young woman was rarely left free to create her own social destiny. Her movements were supervised, her company noted, and her apparent ease within society depended heavily on structures provided by family. She might attend dinners, musical evenings, church, walks, assemblies, or seaside visits. But these settings were not neutral ground. They were watched environments. Her conversation had to be pleasant without becoming bold, her appearance tasteful without appearing either vain or careless, and her conduct modest without sliding into stiffness. Every one of those balances was difficult, and each varied by age, fortune, local custom, and family reputation. It is sometimes assumed that the restrictions of the age made courtship simple in a formal sense, but in reality they often made it more subtle and more exhausting. Direct declaration was not the normal beginning of intimacy. People observed one another through conversation, dancing, repeated meetings, family approval, and tiny accumulations of evidence. A gentleman might distinguish himself by attention, but too much attention too soon could become improper. A lady might encourage without seeming to invite. Family members watched. Friends inferred. Servants noticed. The whole thing required a careful management of signal and restraint that could feel both thrilling and deeply artificial. One of the quiet discomforts of Regency social life is that sincerity often had to pass through ritual before it could safely reveal itself. Balls illustrate this perfectly. They survive in popular imagination as the emblem of the era. Candlelight, music, polished floors, silk, gloves, and a room full of people moving in ordered patterns. And yes, a successful ball could be genuinely pleasurable. It offered excitement, novelty, flirtation, music, display, and the satisfying sense that for a few hours the world had been made brighter and more elegant than usual. But the reality beneath that image was more practical, and sometimes more tiring than later fantasy allows. A ball meant preparation, transport, expense, proper dress, proper introductions, social calculation, and often physical discomfort. Rooms grew hot, candles smoked, floors became crowded, musicians played for long stretches, supper might be delayed, shoes pinched, corsetry or tight tailoring restricted comfort. Hair arrangements could loosen, tempers could fray beneath excellent manners. And even more important than the bodily discomfort was the social arithmetic. Who danced with whom and how often mattered. Who stood up early in the evening with a desirable partner mattered. Who was ignored mattered very much indeed. A lady left sitting too often might feel the slight keenly, and not merely as a wound to vanity. Repeated neglect could suggest something broader about her attractiveness, her family standing, or her marriage prospects. A gentleman who monopolized one partner risked implying serious intention. A host or hostess had to manage the room so that obvious embarrassments were softened if possible. Seen from this angle, the Regency Ball becomes less a simple fantasy of elegance and more a very efficient machine for producing hope, anxiety, comparison, and judgment under conditions of music and candlelight. The same was true in a quieter register of dinner parties. To dine well in Regency England required planning and staff, but it also required a disciplined host and a careful guest list. Dinner did not simply feed people. It arranged them. Seating could flatter, soothe, or provoke. Conversation had to be sustained without descending into vulgarity, political danger, or obvious boredom. There were accepted rhythms to the service of courses, to the withdrawal of the ladies, to the later mingling of the company. Yet behind that formal order lay countless opportunities for discomfort. A dull guest, a tactless remark, an awkward acquaintance, a visible inequality of fortune or breeding, all could unsettle the evening. A successful dinner seemed effortless only because so much had been managed in advance. And then there was the peculiar importance of dancing itself. Modern viewers may see it chiefly as recreation, but dancing in the Regency was also a kind of disciplined social speech. To dance well was to display education, bodily control, health, timing, and ease in company. To dance badly could expose awkwardness that no amount of verbal politeness could quite conceal. Country dances, reels, cotillions, and other forms required memory, attentiveness, and cooperation. There was pleasure in that, but also strain. A shy young person was not simply shy in a corner. They could be visibly shy in motion, before an audience, while required to perform grace. And yet one reason these rituals endured is that they did offer structured opportunities for connection in a world otherwise guarded by rank and surveillance. A dance allowed conversation at close range that daily life might not permit elsewhere. A walk after dinner, under acceptable supervision, could give a pair more room to understand one another. A shared seat at a card table, a duet at the pianoforte, a reading aloud in a family circle, all these gave form to acquaintance. The irony is that the very rules that restricted intimacy also created the narrow corridors through which intimacy could grow. Marriage therefore sat at the center of much Regency social life, even when no one wished to speak too openly of it. This was not only because marriage was celebrated morally or romantically, but because it organized property, inheritance, household formation, and female security in very concrete ways. Love might be hoped for and sometimes found, but marriage was also a legal and economic institution with consequences that reached well beyond personal feeling. A family with daughters had to think about introductions, prospects, settlements, and reputation. A family with sons had to think about income, profession, and what sort of match could be supported. Quiet calculations surrounded even the warmest domestic scenes. Here again, modern assumptions can be misleading. The period is often flattened into either cruel mercenary marriage-making or pure romance softened by empire waist gowns. In truth, most families lived somewhere in the uneasy space between affection and necessity. Parents might genuinely want their children to marry for esteem and compatibility, while also knowing that a disastrous imprudent match could damage the future of an entire household. Young people might long to choose freely, yet feel the pressure of dependence, duty, and limited options. To marry without money could be reckless. To marry without feeling could be bleak. The tragedy, or sometimes the maturity, of Regency life lay in how often people had to negotiate between those truths. This negotiation was even sharper for women because marriage changed not only emotional life but legal standing. Under the system of coverture, a married woman's independent legal identity was severely limited. Her property rights, depending on settlements and circumstances, could effectively pass under her husband's control. That does not mean every marriage was oppressive in personal terms. Many were partnerships of affection and mutual reliance, but structurally the balance of power was not equal. A woman therefore had to think or have others think for her, not merely about whether a man was agreeable, but whether he was responsible, solvent, stable, and socially safe. Charm alone was a poor guarantee. Indeed, one of the age's recurring anxieties was that charm could disguise irresponsibility extremely well. This is why reputation among men mattered too, though differently. A gentleman's honor was not some decorative code existing apart from life. It shaped credit, marriageability, friendship, and standing. To be known as a gambler, a seducer, a spendthrift, or a man unable to govern himself was not merely morally regrettable. It could have immediate practical consequences. Gambling in particular deserves more attention than it usually receives in soft-focus portraits of the era. Card tables and wagers were woven into genteel life, but the boundary between accepted play and destructive habit could be dangerously thin. Fortunes were lost, debts mounted. Families lived under the shadow of sons or husbands whose sociable habits threatened financial ruin, and gambling was not the only sanctioned vice that complicated the polished image of the time. Drinking was widespread, among men especially, though patterns varied enormously by class and circumstance. Public houses, private cellars, dinner tables, clubs, and military circles all sustained drinking cultures. A man might become notably freer, louder, or less judicious after dinner than the composure of the early evening had suggested. The social expectation that ladies retire before the men lingered partly because male sociability after dinner could take on a heavier, less restrained quality. Again, the point is not caricature. The Regency was not uniquely dissolute, but its rituals of civility sat close beside habits that could erode domestic peace and private security. Clubs, particularly in London, formed another important layer of male social life. They offered companionship, information, status, and routine. They also offered escape from the household and a place where politics, gossip, betting, and patronage could circulate efficiently. For some men, the club was almost an extension of home, though one from which wives, daughters, and sisters were excluded. This mattered because so much influence moved informally through these masculine spaces. An appointment, a piece of news, an investment hint, a political mood, a reputation adjusted by conversation. These things could affect families who never entered the room where they were discussed. Women, excluded from such formal arenas of influence, often exercise power more indirectly through kinship networks, hosting, correspondence, patronage, and domestic management. To call that power trivial would be a mistake. A capable woman could shape the social destiny of a household, manage servants, stretch income, cultivate alliances, and protect vulnerable relations with remarkable intelligence. But the very need for such skill points back to the fragility of the system. Homes did not run themselves. Respectability did not maintain itself. Hospitality, one of the great soft virtues of the era, was also labor and strategy. The labor of hosting was especially revealing. Before guests arrived, there were menus to determine, supplies to order, linen to inspect, rooms to heat, silver to prepare, servants to direct, flowers or greenery perhaps to arrange if available, and the household mood to regulate. During the event, the host and hostess performed ease. Afterwards, there was cleaning, accounting, leftovers, breakage, tired staff, and sometimes the sinking knowledge that a charming evening had cost more than prudence really allowed. Regency gentility often looked like leisure when seen from the outside, but from within it could feel like continuous management. That same pattern extended into the so-called season in London, when Parliament was in session and elite society thickened around the capital circuits of calling, dinners, balls, the theatre, parks, concerts, and marriage-making. For those at the top of society, the season could be exhilarating. For those trying to participate from slightly below, it could be financially and emotionally punishing. Lodgings had to be secured, clothes updated, appearances maintained, and daughters presented to advantage. The city promised opportunity and threatened humiliation in equal measure. A successful season might produce a match, a patron, or an improved social footing. An unsuccessful one might leave the family poorer and more anxious than before. Even something as apparently light as fashion carried this burden of social reading. Regency dress is often admired for its flowing lines and pale fabrics, but it was never merely decorative. Fashion signaled awareness, resources, modesty, ambition, age, and sometimes politics. To be out of fashion could mark one as provincial or diminished. To follow fashion too aggressively could suggest vanity, vulgarity, or pretension. Women negotiated hemlines, sleeves, caps, shawls, gloves, jewelry, and fabrics within an unforgiving field of observation. Men, too, were measured by cut, cleanliness, linen, boots, and the elusive quality of looking correct without looking as though they had tried too visibly to be correct. Taste, in other words, was a form of social discipline. And yet, for all this pressure, people did find real enjoyment in society. That must be kept in view. Friends genuinely laughed together. Music gave delight. Courtships did flourish. Country house visits could be warm, stimulating, and genuinely companionable. Conversation, especially in intelligent company, could be one of the era's deepest pleasures. There was satisfaction in managing a good dinner, pleasure in dancing with a favored partner, comfort in a well-timed visit from someone truly welcome. One reason the social world held such power is that it was not simply a prison. It could also be vivid, emotionally charged, and deeply rewarding. Still, it remained precarious. The same network that sustained could exclude. A family fallen into debt might withdraw quietly from circulation. A young woman compromised by rumor might find doors less open than before. An imprudent marriage could sever connections. A political opinion spoken too bluntly in the wrong company could cool an invitation list. Regency society liked to present itself as stable and mannerly, but it could be unforgiving beneath the surface, particularly when questions of money, sex, or rank became too visible to ignore. And this takes us toward one of the most important truths about everyday life in the period. The home and the social world were not separate spheres so much as one continuous fabric. The emotions felt in the ballroom returned to the breakfast table the next morning. The expense of the dinner party appeared later in the household accounts. The promising conversation during a walk became a family discussion behind closed doors. A new acquaintance altered where calls would next be made. A gentleman's conduct in society shaped whether he might be trusted in marriage. A daughter's success in company could shift the hopes of an entire household. Nothing floated free of consequence for very long, which means that if we want to understand what daily existence really felt like, we have to move one layer deeper still into the emotional weather created by all this careful living. Because beneath the manners, beneath the visits and dances and managed appearances, Regency England was also a world of boredom, loneliness, suppressed frustration, companionship, longing, disappointment, and quiet resilience. The routines were elegant only from a distance. From within, they could be soothing or suffocating, depending on one's luck, one's temperament, and the household into which one had been placed. And once we enter that interior world, the famous calm surfaces of the age begin to reveal much more complicated lives underneath. And once we enter that interior world, the famous calm surfaces of the age begin to reveal much more complicated lives underneath. One of the easiest mistakes to make about Regency England is to assume that because daily life was formal, people must therefore have felt less intensely, or at least expressed feeling in a tidier, more manageable way. In truth, the formality often made emotion harder to handle, not easier. Expectations were strict, opportunities were limited, and many of the most important choices in life were entangled with duty, money, family pressure, and reputation. Under those conditions, ordinary disappointment could take on a much larger shape. Boredom, for instance, was one of the quiet facts of respectable life, especially for women. The period offered diversion, certainly, but not constant freedom of movement or purpose. A woman in a comfortable household might have refinement around her and still feel the day stretching before her with oppressive sameness. Reading, drawing, music practice, needlework, letter writing, walks when the weather allowed, visits when the season and local society permitted, these filled the hours, but they did not always amount to fulfillment. Much depended on temperament, companionship, and the quality of the home itself. A lively mind in a narrow household could suffer more acutely than a modern romantic image of the era allows. This matters because it helps explain the emotional charge of seemingly small events. A letter was not just paper. It was interruption, contact, movement from one mental space to another. A visitor was not merely a polite duty. Sometimes a visitor was the day's only real change. A planned outing, a trip to town, a concert, a dinner invitation, the arrival of relations, the loan of a novel. These could all assume great importance because the rhythm of life left room for their weight to be felt. The slowness of the age did not necessarily produce serenity. Quite often, it magnified anticipation. Loneliness, too, could sit inside very full households. People were often surrounded by family, servants, visitors, and obligation, yet had little access to the sort of frank emotional speech that many now regard as healthy or ordinary. To complain too much was unattractive. To be visibly discontented could seem ungrateful, weak, or ill-bred. To speak plainly about unhappiness might disturb the harmony on which the household depended. So much had to be managed through implication, tone, patience, or silence. Even affectionate families could encourage self-command over disclosure. The result was a world in which people were often known socially long before they were understood personally. That is one reason letter writing became so important. Letters in the Regency were not simply practical instruments for conveying information. They were emotional architecture. They sustained friendships across distance, allowed more candor than face-to-face conversations sometimes permitted, softened refusals, deepened courtships, maintained kinship, and gave shape to thought itself. A well-written letter might console, persuade, flatter, reassure, or wound with exquisite precision. It could also preserve a voice within the household that daily decorum might constrain. Some people were more articulate on paper than in person, and not only because writing gave them time to think. It also gave them privacy, or something closer to privacy than the social world usually allowed. But letters also carried danger. A delayed response could create anxiety. A misunderstood phrase could fester. A lost letter could rearrange a future. The very dependence on correspondence made people vulnerable to absence and delay in ways that modern life has partially dissolved. In a culture where direct communication was limited by distance, propriety, and logistics, not hearing from someone could become its own kind of event. Silence was never quite neutral. Within families, emotional life could be tender, dutiful, strained, or all three at once. The family was the core institution of Regency society, but that does not mean it was always warm in the modern intimate sense. Parents loved children, siblings formed strong attachments, aunts and uncles often played large roles, and households could be full of humor and affection. Yet family was also the place where social discipline began. It was where children learned manners, restraint, hierarchy, piety, and the innumerable small habits that would later signal breeding to the outside world. A son might be loved and still pushed toward a profession for which he had little inclination. A daughter might be cherished and still steered toward prudence in a way that felt painfully narrow. Family affection existed within a world that asked people to be useful, presentable, and economically sensible. Mothers in particular occupied a demanding emotional position. In wealthier households, they supervised or oversaw children through servants and governesses, managed hospitality, guarded family reputation, stretched or displayed household means as circumstances required, and often worked quietly to smooth the tempers and ambitions of others. In poorer homes, motherhood meant ceaseless labor made heavier by childbirth, infant illness, washing, cooking, sewing, and the perpetual fear of not having enough. The sentimental image of maternity certainly existed, but the practical burden was immense, and grief was never far away. Infant mortality and childhood illness gave the ordinary business of loving children a sharper edge than modern viewers often fully feel. Attachment was deep, but so was vulnerability. For fathers, authority was expected, but authority itself was not always comfortable. A father was meant to govern the family, preserve its financial soundness, guide children into appropriate paths, and embody steadiness. Yet many men struggled under the weight of those expectations, especially when income was uncertain. A father who could not provide adequately might feel humiliation beneath outward control. One who ruled too harshly might win obedience but lose affection. One who was charming and weak could be more destructive than one who was stern and plain. Regency households, like all households, depended not simply on formal power but on daily character. There is also something important to say about melancholy, nervous suffering, and those forms of inward distress that the period recognized imperfectly and named inconsistently. People certainly experienced depression, anxiety, grief disorders, and emotional breakdowns, but they understood them through different categories. Nerves, spirits, low mood, weakness, sensibility, religious despondency, hysteria, vapors, these and other terms tried to describe states that could be very real and very disabling. Some of these labels were gendered in unfair ways, especially for women, whose distress could be trivialized or folded into assumptions about delicacy. But men, too, suffered in silence under ideals of self-command that left little room for vulnerability. The emotional climate of the age was shaped by religion as well. Anglican practice, evangelical seriousness, dissenting traditions, and habits of private prayer all gave meaning to suffering, duty, and hope. For some, faith was consolation and structure. For others, it could intensify self-scrutiny. The Regency did not live in a secular emotional landscape. Sin, providence, moral discipline, and the possibility of divine order shaped how many people interpreted both happiness and hardship. A death in the family, a financial reversal, a fortunate marriage, recovery from illness, all might be read not only as worldly events but as matters under a larger moral design. This spiritual frame could bring comfort, but it also sat beside a more modern-seeming hunger for feeling. The late 18th and early 19th centuries inherited the culture of sensibility, with its respect for emotional responsiveness, tears, sympathy, and inward depth. That current had not disappeared. People valued tenderness, moral feeling, and the ability to be moved. Yet the Regency also distrusted excess, vulgarity, and theatrical self-display. That tension produced one of the era's most interesting emotional contradictions. People wanted to feel deeply and often did, but they were expected to feel beautifully, proportionately, and in ways that did not disrupt the social order too visibly. Grief offers a particularly clear example. Mourning customs could be elaborate and sincere, with clothing, seclusion, letters of condolence, memorial objects, and carefully observed periods of restraint. Death was familiar in a way it no longer is for many modern people. Families encountered it repeatedly, yet even grief had to be managed within social expectations. One could mourn deeply, but the expression of mourning had accepted forms. Too little feeling looked cold. Too much public emotion could look uncontrolled. The result was not insincerity, exactly, but choreography. Sorrow, like so much else, had to become legible in the right way. That need for legibility affected friendship as well. Same-sex friendships could be intense, affectionate, and central to life. Women wrote to women with warmth and dependence. Men formed bonds through school, service, politics, clubs, profession, and shared family networks. In an age when marriage carried such heavy practical significance, friendship often provided the emotional understanding that formal roles could not. A close friend might receive the truth that relatives only sensed indirectly. The emotional texture of the Regency becomes much richer once we stop imagining everyone as moving only within romantic plots and begin to see the wider fabric of attachment. Servants, too, were part of that fabric, though in ways complicated by hierarchy. In a long-established household, servants could know the family intimately. Their routines, tempers, illnesses, debts, silences, disappointments. A trusted housekeeper, valet, nurse, or maid might become woven into the emotional life of the house, even while the language of rank remained firm. This did not erase inequality. Servants were vulnerable to dismissal, overwork, and condescension. But it does remind us that domestic life in Regency England was full of relationships that were neither entirely personal nor entirely impersonal. Affection and dependence often crossed social lines without ever abolishing them. At the same time, the household could become a place of suffocating observation. One of the costs of living in close quarters with strong family oversight and little privacy was that moods became public very easily. A withdrawn daughter, an irritable father, a disappointed son, a nervous wife, a servant suspected of carelessness, all altered the atmosphere of the home. There was no easy escape into separate inner worlds. People read one another continuously, sometimes accurately, often not. A breakfast table might look composed while carrying the residue of last night's tension in every movement of the teapot and every pause between sentences. This is where the architecture of Regency houses becomes emotionally revealing. The house did not merely shelter family life. It organized it. Public rooms encouraged display, conversation, and sociability. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, schoolrooms, nurseries, servant spaces, kitchens, corridors, staircases, and back passages created a map of access and exclusion. Who could retreat and where depended on rank and means. A lady might have a room in which to write or dress, but not the kind of absolute privacy a modern person assumes. A servant had even less. In a small home, nearly every life unfolded within earshot of someone else. The weather, too, had emotional consequences. Long damp spells, dark afternoons, smoky interiors, muddy roads, and winter cold narrowed the world. Plans were cancelled, visits were postponed, bodies ached, spirits lowered. In summer, dust, smell, flies, and heat brought different irritations. The dependence on weather is one of the most important things to recover when imagining the daily mood of the past. Modern climate control and lighting buffer us from seasonal force. Regency households felt the season directly, and with it the emotional pressure of confinement or relief. A clear day could alter an entire household's prospects. So could a week of rain. Even leisure could carry an undertow of emotional strain. Reading novels might offer escape, but novels also sharpened feeling, creating comparison between lived life and imagined life. Music could soothe, but performing music before others invited judgment. A walk in the countryside might be restorative, but it could also become another social scene if taken on the wrong road at the wrong hour with the wrong companion. Needlework might calm one person and quietly oppress another with its repetitiveness. The Regency did not divide experience neatly into work that burdens and leisure that frees. Much depended on circumstance, company, health, and what inner hopes a person carried. And then there was the quiet problem of disappointment in marriage itself. Because courtship was so constrained and marriage so consequential, the emotional realities after marriage could be difficult to speak about. Some people found companionship, respect, even happiness deeper than expected. Others discovered dullness, incompatibility, selfishness, debt, infidelity, drinking, or simple emotional starvation. Yet separation was difficult, scandalous, and often economically disastrous, especially for women. Many people therefore lived not in dramatic misery, but in long compromise. They adjusted, endured, made private worlds where they could, loved children, cultivated gardens, corresponded with siblings, managed estates, or retreated into habit. Everyday life in the Regency contains a great deal of this quiet endurance, and it is one of the least glamorous truths about the period. There were, of course, households of genuine warmth and mutual respect. It would be unfair and unhistorical to imply that the age was merely trapped beneath its own decorum. Many people loved their spouses, enjoyed their children, valued their friends, found meaning in responsibility, and took honest pleasure in home. But even happy households were built within structures of inequality and uncertainty. The emotional success of a family often depended on character more than system. Kindness mattered because the rules alone did not guarantee safety or comfort. This helps explain why moral judgment was so prominent in the era's conversations, novels, sermons, and private anxieties. If law, custom, and property arranged life imperfectly, then personal conduct seemed all the more important. Prudence, steadiness, sincerity, self-command, generosity, and reliability were not abstract virtues. They were practical safeguards in a world where one selfish or reckless person could make life miserable for many others. A vain husband, a foolish heir, an indiscreet daughter, a manipulative relation, a careless servant, a spendthrift son, all could destabilize the fragile order of the home. That fragility becomes even clearer when we remember how many people lived close to thresholds they hoped never to cross. The threshold from comfort into embarrassment, from modest prosperity into debt, from courtship into disappointment, from illness into death, from social acceptance into gossip, from employment into uncertainty. Regency life often appears composed because so much energy went into preventing those thresholds from becoming visible. But the thresholds were there all the time, and many crossed them, which is why the emotional world of the Regency cannot be separated from its material realities. People did not worry in the abstract. They worried about coal, bills, dowries, pregnancies, shoes, references, rents, letters, servants giving notice, sons lacking direction, daughters approaching the age at which novelty faded in the marriage market, parents growing ill, and neighbors who knew too much. The psychological life of the period was domestic in a very concrete sense. Anxiety sat in the parlor, at the writing desk, by the nursery fire, and in the pause before opening the post. And once we see that, another side of everyday life comes into focus as well. The way people sought relief. Some found it in religion, some in books, some in gardens and walks, some in conversation, some in fashion, card-playing, theater, or music, some in alcohol, some in travel, some in work itself. Relief mattered because pressure was chronic. The polished exterior of Regency society was not maintained by ease, but often by carefully chosen forms of escape, comfort, and self-distraction that made the burdens of ordinary existence more bearable. That search for relief carried people outward into the wider culture of entertainment, spectacle, and public life, where the Regency becomes stranger again. Because the same society that asked for restraint at home also loved theater, scandal, newspapers, prints, celebrity, and public display. Private discipline and public fascination lived side by side. And to understand what everyday life really felt like, we have to follow people out of the drawing room now and into those brighter, noisier spaces where amusement, gossip, status, and anxiety met in full view. And to understand what everyday life really felt like, we have to follow people out of the drawing room now and into those brighter, noisier spaces where amusement, gossip, status, and anxiety met in full view. Regency England could be intensely domestic, but it was never quiet in the larger cultural sense. Beyond the home there existed a restless appetite for diversion, information, scandal, novelty, and spectacle. The same people who valued restraint in conduct might spend the evening at the theater, read the latest satirical print in a shop window, discuss a notorious elopement, or follow the movements of the Prince Regent with fascination mixed uneasily with moral disapproval. Public life was not separate from private values. It tested them, entertained them, and often exposed their contradictions. The theater is a good place to begin, because it reveals so much about the age at once. A night at the theater was not merely about the play. It was about being seen, meeting acquaintances, displaying taste, judging performers, and participating in a shared urban ritual. The patent theaters in London, along with smaller venues and provincial stages, offered drama, comedy, opera, spectacle, and musical entertainment to audiences with varying expectations and levels of refinement. A performance might be admired sincerely, but the social performance inside the audience mattered almost as much. People looked not only at the stage but at one another. Boxes displayed rank. Applause or disapproval could be loud and immediate. Conversation, movement, rustling, and the general energy of the room made the experience far less hushed than the modern theater-goer might expect. It was also more physically demanding. Theaters could be crowded, overheated, badly ventilated, and unevenly lit. Clothing that seemed magnificent on arrival could become burdensome after hours of sitting, craning, reacting, and waiting through long programs. Travel to and from the theater introduced another layer of inconvenience, especially at night in poor weather. Yet people went because the theater offered something that respectable domestic life often could not: a sanctioned space for stronger feeling. Tragedy, wit, sentiment, ridicule, music, and visual display all gathered there. It was a place where emotion could become public under controlled conditions. That, perhaps, is part of why actors occupied such a curious position in Regency culture. They could be admired, imitated, discussed, and even adored, while still existing outside the cleanest definitions of respectability. Celebrity was already forming in recognizable ways. Famous performers drew attention not only for talent but for style, personality, and private lives. This mattered because Regency England liked to imagine clear moral categories while being irresistibly drawn toward lives that blurred them. The performer, like the fashionable rake or the politically notorious prince, embodied a kind of public fascination that respectable society officially judged and unofficially consumed with great appetite. Print culture widened that appetite enormously. Newspapers, journals, pamphlets, caricatures, and circulating libraries made the Regency a remarkably mediated age. Public life increasingly arrived at the breakfast table in printed form. Political debate, military news, parliamentary conflict, criminal cases, royal embarrassment, literary fashion, foreign affairs, and local advertisement all flowed through a growing culture of reading. Even those who were not regular purchasers might encounter this world indirectly, through borrowed papers, coffee houses, inns, reading rooms, shop windows, or conversation. England was not yet modern in the mass media sense, but it was already a society in which information moved fast enough to reshape mood and expectation from one week to the next. Satirical prints deserve special attention because they capture the Regency's mixture of elegance and cruelty unusually well. In shop windows, caricatures by artists such as Gilray or Rowlandson could attract clusters of viewers who laughed, pointed, and absorbed their sharp visual judgments of politicians, dandies, military men, and members of the royal family. These images were funny, but not gentle. They exaggerated bodies, appetites, vanity, corruption, and folly with a boldness that reminds us the age was not always polished in tone. Beneath the manners lay a relish for exposure. To be ridiculous in public was dangerous, because ridicule could travel. A caricature condensed gossip into image and made the age's habits of judgment visible. The Prince Regent himself stood at the center of this paradox. Here was the symbolic figure of the era, associated with style, architecture, dining, fashion, and display, yet also widely criticized for extravagance, debt, selfishness, and moral carelessness. People followed his tastes and mocked his behavior, admired his patronage and distrusted his character. He represented the Regency in more than the constitutional sense. He embodied its tension between surface brilliance and underlying disorder. The Brighton Pavilion, with its theatrical exoticism, remains one of the best visual summaries of that world. Dazzling, playful, expensive, inventive, and just a little uneasy, as though splendor itself had become a way of avoiding something harder and less decorative. Public amusement extended well beyond the theater and the courtly orbit of the prince. Pleasure gardens such as Vauxhall, though declining from their earlier peak by the Regency, still lingered in cultural memory as places where music, light, supper, promenading, and controlled sociability came together in an atmosphere slightly looser than the drawing room allowed. Fairs, races, assemblies, concerts, exhibitions, panoramas, and public lectures all offered ways of stepping out of the home into semi-public experiences shared with strangers as well as acquaintances. This mattered in a society still so conscious of rank, because these spaces brought classes into proximity, even when not on equal terms. The crowd itself became part of the experience. That crowd could be exhilarating and unsettling at once. London especially trained people to live among strangers, and this had psychological consequences. One could disappear more easily in the metropolis than in a provincial town, but that freedom came with risk. Pickpockets, swindlers, prostitutes, political agitators, informers, drunks, and the simply desperate moved through the same streets as fashionable ladies and gentlemen. The city allowed reinvention, but it also exposed people to unpredictability on a scale unfamiliar in smaller communities. That is one reason urban entertainment could feel so charged. It was pleasure with an edge of danger, however mild or serious the immediate risk. Coffee houses and taverns contributed to this public culture in different ways. Earlier in the 18th century, coffee houses had been central to discussion and political exchange, and although their place had evolved by the Regency, They still belonged to the wider world of male conversation, newspapers, commerce, and observation. Taverns and alehouses, meanwhile, crossed more social boundaries and served as places of drinking, business, dispute, sociability, and sometimes disorder. To describe them simply as rough would be misleading. They were also part of the infrastructure of everyday life. Meetings were arranged there. News was heard there. Coaches stopped there. Local politics and gossip lived there. But they remind us that public life in Regency England was not composed solely of elegant rooms. It also rested on louder, smokier, more mixed environments in which class and respectability could be negotiated in more exposed ways. For women, access to public amusement remained more conditional. Respectable women certainly attended theaters, concerts, promenades, assemblies, and shops, but usually within accepted frameworks of companionship and timing. A woman alone in public space could attract scrutiny in ways a man alone would not. This sharpened the importance of chaperonage, family grouping, and the moral coding of places. Some spaces were considered safer, more polished, or more respectable than others. This is worth dwelling on because it reveals how fragile female freedom of movement could be. A woman might enjoy urban culture, but often only by passing through it under protection, with every appearance interpreted as evidence of character. Even the simple act of walking contained layers of meaning. Promenading in parks, on crescents, in spa towns, or along seaside fronts was an important social ritual, not just exercise. It allowed visibility without the full intensity of indoor conversation. People could observe and be observed, exchange greetings, note dress, companionship, and health, and participate in the social life of a place through movement itself. But again, what appears leisurely was structured. There were suitable hours, suitable companions, suitable routes. A walk at the wrong time or in the wrong company might create talk. Public space in the Regency was not free space. It was red space. One of the most revealing entertainment forms of the age was the panorama, a massive painted visual experience designed to immerse the viewer in battle scenes, foreign cities, dramatic landscapes, or major events. These spectacles were enormously popular because they offered something both educational and thrilling. The Regency audience was curious about the wider world, and Britain's military, imperial, and commercial reach fed that curiosity. To stand before a great painted representation of a distant place or a recent battle was to experience a kind of controlled wonder. Yet here, too, the age's contradictions are visible. Many viewers encountered empire and war as spectacle long before they understood them as systems of power, suffering, and profit. This is true of museums and exhibitions as well. Collections of antiquities, natural specimens, paintings, and curiosities formed part of a growing culture of improvement and display. To look at such things was to participate in a broader sense that knowledge, taste, and empire were somehow connected. Objects gathered from abroad entered British interiors and institutions as signs of cultivation. The everyday English experience could thus include small encounters with the wider world through tea, sugar, cotton, books, prints, orientalizing fashions, classical motifs, and displayed objects whose origins lay in conquest, trade, or extraction. Much of Regency comfort was quietly global, even when the household using it never spoke of that fact. And then there was scandal, perhaps one of the age's most persistent entertainments. Scandal mattered because it allowed society to enjoy transgression while reaffirming its own rules. A failed marriage, an elopement, an affair, a political indiscretion, a gambling disaster, a drunken public scene, all could be consumed as both warning and amusement. Newspapers, letters, and conversation transmitted such stories quickly. There was moralising, certainly, but also pleasure. Scandal was the Regency's way of peering at the instability beneath its own ideals. Every notorious case whispered the same unsettling truth, that the polished order of society depended on human beings who were often impulsive, vain, hungry, frightened, and not especially good at being symbols of virtue. The royal family provided endless material here. Their marriages, quarrels, debts, and embarrassments were followed with a mixture of reverence and sharp suspicion. The unhappy marriage of the Prince of Wales and Caroline of Brunswick, and the public controversies that followed, showed how thin the line could be between official dignity and near-theatrical exposure. Ordinary people might never enter a palace, but they could still consume the emotional spectacle of royal domestic disorder. This mattered because monarchy was not merely distant pageantry. It was woven into national identity, and when royal life looked vulgar, selfish, or chaotic, it unsettled the moral language through which many people understood rank itself. Crime, too, occupied the public imagination. The Regency city, and especially London, was full of anxieties about theft, forgery, highway robbery, prostitution, violence, and fraud. Some of these fears were rooted in real risks, others in exaggeration or selective attention, but together they produced an atmosphere in which public life felt exciting and unstable. Broadsides, pamphlets, court reports, and newspaper accounts turned criminality into another form of entertainment, even as punishments remained severe. It is difficult for a modern audience to fully feel how ordinary the presence of public punishment, legal threat, and visible poverty could be. A walk through the city might pass a debtor's prison, a court, a crowded market, a military parade, a beggar, and a fashionable shop within a short distance. The moral and sensory contrasts were relentless. This contrast is especially visible in the world of shopping and display. The Regency is often remembered as a period in which consumer culture became more elegant, and that is true to an extent. Streets of shops offered fabrics, hats, gloves, books, prints, jewelry, stationery, and imported luxuries in ways that made desire more visible. But shopping was not simply pleasure. It also sharpened awareness of exclusion. Shop windows tempt by definition. They allow people to stand outside the life they suggest. A clerk's wife, a governess, a merchant's daughter, an impoverished gentlewoman, each might look at goods differently, measuring not only beauty but distance. The growth of consumer display therefore intensified one of the age's constant emotional themes: the uneasy comparison between what one saw and what one could truly sustain. Music formed another layer of public and semi-public life. Concerts, amateur musicales, pleasure garden performances, military bands, church music, and songs performed at home all contributed to the period's soundscape. Music in the Regency was not background in the modern sense. It was event, accomplishment, and emotional language. A young woman at the pianoforte was not merely amusing the room. She was displaying education, taste, patience, and bodily discipline. A public singer or instrumentalist might stir admiration that crossed social boundaries. A song popular in drawing rooms could carry sentimental associations into domestic memory. Music softened the hardness of everyday life, but it also required training, attention, and often money. If all this made public life feel richer, it also made it more exhausting. To be continually legible in society, to know what one wore, where one went, with whom one was seen, what one had read, whether one was sufficiently informed but not too opinionated, fashionable but not vulgar, sociable but not needy, all of this demanded energy. That is one reason retreat to the country retained such appeal, even for those who enjoyed London. Rural life might be duller in some respects, but it could also mean relief from scrutiny, or at least from one kind of scrutiny. Provincial communities had their own forms of closeness and gossip, often more persistent because everyone knew everyone else. Still, the contrast between metropolitan excitement and country steadiness shaped much of Regency existence. People moved between these worlds, adjusting themselves as they went. The countryside itself was not silent or idyllic in the simple way later nostalgia sometimes suggests. It included work, estate management, tenant relations, parish responsibilities, local rivalries, agricultural change, and the quiet hierarchies of village life. But it also offered rhythms different from the city's spectacle. Walks, rides, reading, family dinners, neighborhood calls, church, seasonal events, and the close observation of weather and land shaped daily experience. For some, this was deep comfort. For others, it was monotony with a pleasant view. The same setting could feel peaceful or suffocating depending on age, fortune, and expectation. One subtle but important truth about Regency entertainment is that it often blurred the line between being amused and being instructed. Lectures on science, demonstrations, exhibitions, natural philosophy, travel accounts, and improving literature all attracted interest. This was an age that liked to think of itself as cultivated. Curiosity had status. To know something of art, books, geography, or scientific discovery could enhance one's social presence. Yet even improvement could become another burden. The accomplished person was expected not only to behave well, but to have read enough, listened enough, observed enough, and formed opinions that sounded intelligent without becoming abrasive. Culture itself became part of the performance of adulthood. At the heart of this lies one of the strangest aspects of everyday life in Regency England. People were constantly balancing inward experience against outward impression. Public amusements offered relief from private constraint, but they also created new opportunities for judgment. The theater allowed feeling, but placed one on display. The concert elevated taste, but exposed one's discernment. The promenade permitted visibility, but made visibility its own pressure. The print shop entertained, but sharpened ridicule. The city widened the world, but multiplied comparisons. The country quieted noise, but could intensify enclosure. There was almost nowhere, for the respectable classes at least, where one could simply be unobserved without consequence. And that is why the servant, the shopkeeper, the coachman, the companion, the neighbor, the relation, and the stranger in the assembly room all matter so much in this story. Everyday life in the Regency was built from constant mutual reading. A person's world was assembled from impressions given off in fragments. A glove too worn, a bill unpaid, an awkward introduction, a phrase repeated in another household, a man seen too often at the card table, a woman too eager for a rich acquaintance, a daughter looking pale after a season of disappointments, a son returned from town with habits his father did not admire. Public life amplified private truth, but it also invented stories of its own. This widening world of spectacle and information also changed how people imagine themselves historically. Battles, parliamentary struggles, imperial campaigns, royal scandals, and social change all entered ordinary conversation more directly than before. A shopkeeper in town, a clergyman's family in a rectory, a naval officer's widow, a lawyer, a merchant, a governess, a fashionable hostess, each inhabited the same broad historical moment but felt it differently. The Regency was not one single experience. It was a layered social weather system in which war, class, gender, commerce, and culture moved through daily life with unequal force. And as the years of the Regency went on, the bright surfaces of entertainment and public display had to coexist with something more uneasy gathering underneath. Crowds could amuse, but crowds could also protest. Newspapers could entertain, but they could also radicalize. Public speech could flatter the social order, but it could just as easily reveal how contested that order had become. The spaces of spectacle and sociability were beginning to brush against spaces of political tension more openly. which means the next step is to look at what happened when the carefully managed everyday world of Regency England met unrest more directly, and when ordinary people, not just fashionable ones, began pressing their grievances into public view. Which means the next step is to look at what happened when the carefully managed everyday world of Regency England met unrest more directly, and when ordinary people, not just fashionable ones, began pressing their grievances into public view. This is where the age becomes even more revealing, because political tension in Regency England was not some distant matter debated only by ministers and newspapers. It reached into kitchens, workshops, farms, taverns, market squares, parish offices, and family conversations. The same country that could produce exquisite manners and elegant assembly rooms was also a country in which many people were hungry, angry, and increasingly unconvinced that the old arrangements worked in their favor. It is important to move slowly here, because the Regency has often been remembered through the people with the best surviving portraits, the best houses, and the most quotable correspondence. But the majority of people in England lived far from drawing-room polish. Their daily experience was more likely to be defined by wages, bread, rent, parish relief, harvests, and the uncertainty of employment. When harvests failed or prices rose, hardship was immediate. There was no large buffer of savings for many laboring households. A bad season was not an inconvenience. It was the difference between eating enough and not eating enough, heating a room and sitting cold, buying shoes for a child or waiting and hoping the old pair might somehow last. That fragility made politics tangible. Debates over grain prices, taxation, poor relief, enclosure, industrial change, and representation in Parliament were not abstract constitutional questions to many people. They were woven into the practical business of survival. A laborer did not need a political treatise to understand that bread cost too much. A weaver did not need a philosophical system to know that wages had fallen and family life was harder than before. A discharged soldier returning after war did not need a newspaper editorial to feel that peace had failed to deliver the security he had imagined. In that sense, the unrest of the Regency was often rooted in the body before it was translated into speeches. Food sits at the center of this story. The so-called bread question haunted everyday life because bread remained a staple for enormous numbers of people. The price of grain, therefore, carried a moral as well as an economic charge. When bread became dear, it was not experienced merely as market fluctuation. It was felt as social failure. People talked about the cost of the loaf with a seriousness modern listeners might reserve for rent or medical bills, because bread occupied that level of daily necessity. A rise in price was discussed in homes, at work, in parish offices, at markets, and in the streets. It altered the emotional atmosphere of communities. For the poor, hunger often appeared not as spectacular starvation but as shrinking margins. Meals became simpler, smaller, less nourishing. Small indulgences vanished. Fuel was saved. Clothing went unreplaced. Children grew in households where the adults were perpetually calculating. This slow pressure could make tempers short and hope thin. It also made the respectable poor and the lower middle classes deeply anxious, because they often feared not only suffering but visible dissent. To need relief from the parish, to lose independence, to seem unable to manage one's own family, these carried stigma as well as pain. Parish relief itself was one of the great practical realities of everyday Regency life. Under the Old Poor laws, local parishes bore responsibility for supporting their poor, but the system was inconsistent, contested, and increasingly strained. Relief might come in money, food, work, or access to poorhouses, depending on place and circumstance. In some districts, there were attempts to supplement low wages according to bread prices and family size. In others, authorities worried that relief encouraged dependence and undermined labor discipline. The result was a patchwork of local management that made the experience of poverty uneven and often humiliating. The poor were not simply unsupported, but they were supported through structures that frequently demanded scrutiny, proof, and submission. This matters because it helps explain the emotional charge of resentment in the period. Many working people did not merely feel poor. They felt judged while poor. A man seeking relief might have to expose family circumstances, justify his need, and submit to the opinions of local overseers or magistrates. A widow might depend on the goodwill of a system that was never entirely secure. The respectable classes often spoke of charity and duty, and sometimes acted with real generosity, but there remained a deep paternalism in the structure of local power. Those who suffered were rarely allowed to suffer privately. Enclosure sharpened some of these tensions in rural districts. The enclosing of common lands had been proceeding in waves for generations, and it was not a simple story of single cause and single consequence. In some places it improved agricultural efficiency. In others it clearly damaged the independence of the rural poor by limiting access to grazing, fuel gathering, and small supplementary resources that had once helped families survive. What matters for everyday life is that enclosure often meant a more disciplined and less flexible countryside. People who had once relied on customary rights found those rights reduced or gone. The landscape itself became more ordered, but the human cost of that order was not evenly distributed. A village under these pressures could remain outwardly calm while inwardly strained. Church bells still rang. Labor still began early. Market days still came and went. Yet behind the appearance of continuity, households might be more dependent on wages alone, more exposed to price shocks, and more resentful of landlords or magistrates than earlier generations had been. The old moral economy, in which local elites were expected to protect their communities in visible ways during hardship, was fraying. Market logic was becoming more powerful, but many people had not accepted that prices and profit should override customary expectations of fairness. In towns and industrial districts, the pressure took a somewhat different form. The Regency years saw continuing transformation in manufacturing, transport, and urban growth. For some this brought opportunity. For others it brought dislocation. Skilled artisans could find themselves undercut by new methods, new machinery, or new labor arrangements. Work that had once been organized within household or workshop structures might now be subject to new kinds of discipline and new forms of dependency. The emotional consequence of this was not only poverty, but wounded status. A man who had regarded himself as a skilled producer could feel diminished when his labor became more precarious or less respected. This is one reason the Luddite disturbances, beginning in the 1810s, should not be dismissed as simple fear of machines. That shallow version misses the human logic entirely. The machine was often a symbol of a broader grievance. Falling wages, degraded standards of production, exploitative employers, and the erosion of older understandings of fairness within skilled trades. Breaking frames or machinery was a way of making visible a protest that had practical, not irrational, roots. The authorities treated such actions with extraordinary seriousness, and the state responded harshly, but the unrest itself tells us something essential about Regency daily life. Beneath the language of improvement and progress, many people experience change as loss. The presence of soldiers in this story is also important. During the long years of war, military service had become a normal fact in national life. Men served abroad, returned wounded, failed to return at all, or re-entered civilian life marked by experiences few at home could fully understand. Naval families lived with the sea as a permanent risk. Officers might return with prestige. Common soldiers often returned to much less. When peace finally came after Waterloo, England did not become immediately gentler or easier. Demobilization added more men to a strained labor market. The patriotic unity created by war gave way to the discontents of peace. That shift could feel bitter. Victory did not feed people. If anything, the years after 1815 exposed just how unstable the social order remained. The end of war brought economic dislocation, unemployment, and continuing high food prices. Public hopes that peace would naturally restore comfort were disappointed. This disappointment matters because it deepened the sense that something was structurally wrong. The rituals of monarchy, parliament, and established hierarchy continued, but the moral confidence behind them was weaker. To many ordinary people, national triumph abroad sat uneasily beside hardship at home. In such a climate, meetings, petitions, pamphlets, and public speeches became increasingly important. Politics moved into open air. Reformers, radicals, and local activists tried to create a language through which ordinary grievances could be heard. Not everyone involved wanted revolution. Many wanted representation, accountability, relief, and recognition rather than the destruction of all order. But the governing classes often feared that reform talk might slide towards something far more dangerous, especially in the shadow of the French Revolution and the memory of mass upheaval across the Channel. This fear shaped the official response to dissent. The authorities did not always distinguish carefully between agitation and rebellion. Sometimes they preferred not to. That preference affected everyday life because it made public gathering itself politically charged. To attend a meeting, hear a speaker, sign a petition, or simply stand in a crowd could become an act open to suspicion. Informers, magistrates, local elites, and newspapers all participated in defining whether an assembly was respectable expression or threatening disorder. And yet people kept gathering because grievance had nowhere else to go. The ordinary routines of work and home did not cancel political feeling. They intensified it. A man who had spent the week struggling to feed his children did not enter a reform meeting as a theorist. He entered it as someone already exhausted by the life he was being asked to endure. Women were present in this political climate too, even if formal power remained largely closed to them. They attended some meetings, signed petitions, participated in household economies strained by prices, and contributed to the emotional and practical life of protest communities. Female political societies appeared in some places, though often under greater scrutiny or ridicule. More broadly, women's daily labor made the consequences of policy immediate. A rise in bread prices was felt in the management of meals. A husband's unemployment was felt in the household's entire emotional weather. Political history, seen closely, often begins in domestic strain. The authorities, however, tended to imagine unrest through the lens of threat. Magistrates watched crowds. Troops could be called in. Local elites worried about sedition, property, and control. The state had legal tools ready for repression, and it used them. Suspension of liberties, surveillance, arrests, and prosecutions were not remote possibilities. They formed part of the lived environment of contested politics. This again complicates the nostalgic view of the Regency as mainly a world of good breeding and elegant entertainments. It was also a world in which the state could be stern, suspicious, and heavily armed when confronted by popular pressure. Reading culture played a role here as well. Cheap print spread ideas, rumors, arguments, and emotional momentum. Radical pamphlets, broadsides, newspapers, and songs moved through communities, sometimes aloud as much as silently. Literacy mattered, but so did collective hearing. A printed text might be read to others in a workshop, tavern, or home. Political culture therefore entered daily life through voice as much as page. Ideas about rights, corruption, liberty, and representation were not confined to gentlemen debating in Parliament. They circulated downward and outward through practices of discussion that could be informal and intense. And yet it would be wrong to imagine all ordinary people as consistently radical or united. Regency England was full of division. Between trades, between regions, between established workers and the desperate poor, between reformers and loyalists, between Anglican frameworks of order and more dissenting cultures of criticism, between those who feared change and those who felt they had nothing left to lose. Public opinion was fractured. That is one reason the age feels so unsettled on close inspection. Under the appearance of stable hierarchy lay a great deal of disagreement about what England was becoming. The family, again, becomes a useful lens. Political differences could exist within households. A father might be cautious and deferential while a son was drawn to reform. A servant might hear radical arguments in town and return to a house whose master considered such talk dangerous nonsense. A wife might not attend public meetings but understand very clearly why her husband did. These tensions did not always break families apart, but they reveal how deeply public questions entered ordinary life. Politics was not somewhere else. It was at supper, on the road, at market, in churchyard conversation, and in the careful choice of what one dared say in mixed company. Church itself occupied an ambiguous place in this tense world. The established Church of England remained tied to authority, local leadership, and moral order. Parish clergy could be sources of comfort, discipline, conservatism, or practical assistance depending on character and circumstance. Dissenting traditions, meanwhile, often provided alternative moral communities, habits of reading, and sometimes sympathy for reform. Religion could therefore either stabilize the status quo or provide language for criticism, though rarely in simple ways. Even among the poor, endurance was not only economic. It was moral and spiritual. People drew strength from sermons, hymns, prayer, and communal belonging, just as others drew courage from political speech. One subtle but important aspect of unrest is how it altered the meaning of ordinary spaces. A field could become a meeting ground. A tavern room could become political. A marketplace could become a site of confrontation. A road could carry troops as easily as produce. The built and natural environment of Regency England was not neutral. Under pressure, familiar places acquired a new tension. To pass through town on the day of a gathering was not the same as passing through on any other market morning. Sound changed, faces changed, expectation changed. People watched more closely. This is perhaps why the authorities placed such importance on visibility and example. Public order had to be seen to hold. Uniforms, magistrates, proclamations, and mounted troops all communicated power theatrically as well as practically. The state understood, in its own way, that everyday life depended partly on perception. If crowds believed authority was hesitant, more might gather. If local elites appeared divided, grievances might harden into open defiance. So repression was often meant not only to stop immediate disorder but to shape the emotional atmosphere of future days. Nothing shows this more starkly than the events surrounding Peterloo in 1819. By then, years of economic difficulty and political frustration had produced large reform meetings in the manufacturing districts. In Manchester, a peaceful crowd gathered to hear speakers advocate parliamentary reform. Many came dressed respectably, with families, as though insisting through their appearance that they were citizens, not a mob. That detail matters. Clothing, order, and self-presentation were being used politically. The crowd was saying, in effect, that it knew how respectability worked and intended to claim it. The authorities saw danger where many participants believed they were demonstrating legitimate grievance. The decision to arrest speakers and disperse the meeting led to the cavalry charge that turned the gathering into chaos and bloodshed. The shock of Peterloo echoed widely because it exposed, with terrible clarity, the fragility of the regime's claims about order and paternal care. Men and women who had assembled under banners and political hope were cut down in a scene that felt to many like a revelation of what authority became when challenged publicly by ordinary people. For everyday life, the significance of Peterloo was not only in the dead and injured, terrible though that was. It was in the atmosphere that followed. Fear, anger, bitterness, and renewed argument entered homes far beyond Manchester. People discussed what had happened, whom to blame, whether reform was now more urgent or more dangerous. The government's subsequent repressive measures, often grouped under the Six Acts, were designed to curb radical meetings and publications, but they also told ordinary people something about the state's priorities. The message was that stability would be protected, even at the expense of open political expression. And yet repression did not erase grievance. It often drove it inward, where it mixed with memory. A household that had sent a son or husband to a reform meeting did not forget easily. A community that had seen troops turn against a crowd carried that image into future years. The emotional history of the Regency includes these carried memories, not only the recorded laws and speeches. People went on baking bread, mending clothes, going to work, making calls, attending church, and managing households, but the sense of what authority might do in a crisis had changed. This makes the final years of the Regency particularly complex. On the surface, society still moved through its familiar rituals. There were still dinners, promenades, assemblies, scandals, marriages, sermons, and household economies. But beneath that continuity, public trust was uneven. Some people remained loyal, conservative, and sincerely fearful of radical disorder. Others were increasingly certain that polite deference had delivered too little. Many simply tried to keep their families afloat without being crushed between hardship and politics. The everyday reality of the age was not one mood but many, layered together. And once we understand that, the image of Regency England alters again. It is no longer just an age of manners burdened by discomfort, or an age of elegance shadowed by inequality. It is also an age in which the management of daily life and the management of political order began to collide more openly. The breakfast table and the reform meeting were not separate worlds. They were connected by prices, wages, print, memory, and hope. And from there, another question emerges almost naturally. When the formal regency ended and the prince became king, how much of everyday life truly changed, and how much of this uneasy world simply carried itself forward under a different name? And from there, another question emerges almost naturally. When the formal regency ended and the prince became king, how much of everyday life truly changed, and how much of this uneasy world simply carried itself forward under a different name? In one sense, the answer is surprisingly little. Political labels shifted. A reign changed. Generations adjusted their language. But the habits, pressures, and material facts that shaped ordinary existence did not suddenly vanish because the calendar and the crown had moved on. If anything, one of the most revealing things about Regency England is how much of what people later called the Regency was already fading while it still existed, and how much of it lingered after its formal end. Historical periods often look neater in retrospect than they felt at the time. To the people living through them, life was less a clean chapter than a long passage of overlapping habits. That is worth pausing over, because it helps rescue the period from costume. The Regency was not experienced as a frozen tableau of pale muslin, elegant wit, and controlled flirtation. It was experienced as seasons, bills, family changes, illnesses, deaths, births, moves, marriages, disappointments, rising prices, weather, and work. The end of the prince's regency in 1820 mattered constitutionally. It did not immediately reheat cold bedrooms, secure a daughter's future, restore common rights, soften class anxiety, or simplify the labor of managing a respectable household on limited means. The lived texture remained stubbornly continuous. And yet symbols did matter. The death of George III and the accession of George IV altered the emotional atmosphere of public life in subtle ways. George III, despite the tragedy of his later mental decline, had long stood for a certain domestic seriousness in the national imagination, however imperfectly embodied in reality. The Prince Regent, by contrast, had become associated with expenditure, display, appetite, and theatricality. When he took the crown, that symbolism hardened. People could feel that the nation's highest image now belonged not to old-fashioned restraint but to a style of kingship more openly bound to magnificence, taste, and unpopularity. That did not change the daily rhythm of a market town in a single stroke, but it did influence how people spoke about authority, example, and moral seriousness. The affair of Queen Caroline made this especially vivid. George IV's estranged wife returned to Britain in 1820 and became the center of a great public confrontation when the king attempted to exclude her from the status of queen through legal means. The case turned royal domestic misery into national theater. Crowds took sides. Newspapers fed the drama. The private failures of a marriage at the summit of the monarchy became public matter on a scale that would have felt startlingly intimate and deeply political. This too belongs to everyday life, because ordinary people followed it not as detached constitutional scholars but as readers, talkers, arguers, and emotional participants. Public opinion was forming around the spectacle of a marriage that had decayed into vengeance, embarrassment, and class-coded judgment. There is something revealing in the sympathy many people extended to Caroline. She was not admired because she perfectly embodied refinement. Quite the opposite. Part of her appeal lay in the sense that the establishment, in trying to humiliate her, had exposed its own vanity and cruelty. The scandal offered ordinary people a moral drama in which rank itself seemed less trustworthy than injured feeling. That mattered in a culture already distrustful of elite self-indulgence. It suggested again that the polished structures of the age were vulnerable to ridicule and moral reversal. A king could possess palaces, jewels, and ceremony and still lose ground in the court of everyday opinion. This widening importance of opinion is one of the strongest threads linking the late Regency to what followed. Public life was becoming more emotional, more mediated, and in some ways more national. A provincial household could feel connected to London not only through goods and governance but through shared scandal, shared print culture, shared outrage, and shared fascination. The distance between capital and country remained real, yet newspapers and letters shortened it psychologically. The breakfast table in a small town might now receive, with a little delay, the same moral theater that animated Westminster or St. James's. England was still a country of strong local worlds, but those worlds were becoming more tightly bound into larger narratives. That did not mean all households interpreted events alike. One of the central realities of everyday life in this period is divergence. A country clergyman's family, a merchant household, an artisan home, a servant in lodgings, a naval widow, a Yorkshire labourer, a London shopkeeper, a wealthy landowner in Bath during the season, each encountered the nation differently. Shared headlines did not create shared interests. The same royal scandal might be amusing gossip in one house, proof of national moral decline in another, and little more than background noise in a home where the price of flour mattered more than the king's marriage. This unevenness is important because it prevents the period from flattening into one collective mood. Still, as the 1820s opened, there was a sense in many quarters that England was entering a more exposed, more argued-over form of modern life. Consumption expanded, fashion shifted, towns grew, print multiplied. Reform pressure did not disappear. Religious seriousness remained powerful, yet so did leisure and display. The old landed order still dominated much of social authority, but it was increasingly forced to negotiate with money made elsewhere, with urban influence, and with a public that could not be managed as quietly as before. To live through this was to feel both continuity and acceleration. Much remained familiar, yet the familiar no longer felt entirely secure. Inside the home, these broader shifts registered in surprisingly intimate ways. Household management became, if anything, more complex as consumer goods grew more varied and expectations of comfort, cleanliness, and propriety expanded. The middling ranks especially felt this tension. They had to present themselves as competent participants in a culture of refinement while often lacking the large incomes that made such refinement easy. More goods on the market did not necessarily mean more ease. Sometimes it meant more pressure to choose correctly, furnish correctly, dress correctly, and maintain the visible signs of belonging. The market widened aspiration as much as it widened comfort. One sees this in interiors. The Regency taste for elegant furniture, controlled ornament, polished surfaces, and selective classical influence was not only an elite matter. Elements of fashionable style filtered down, adapted to smaller incomes and narrower spaces. A modest parlor might contain one or two objects chosen carefully to suggest taste beyond actual wealth. Curtains, chairs, tea sets, mirrors, carpets, wallpaper, all became part of a visual language of self-presentation. Yet behind that language remained the old practical burdens. Dust, damp, cleaning, breakage, servants if affordable, labor if not. A room could look composed in the afternoon and require hours of work to restore after guests departed. This growing culture of domestic display also sharpened the role of women as managers of visible order. Even when they lacked formal public power, women in respectable households were increasingly expected to exercise judgment over interiors, hospitality, clothing, and the moral tone of family life. The home was becoming not merely where life happened, but where identity was performed and secured. A well-kept home signaled thrift, taste, discipline, and moral steadiness. A disorderly one suggested failure extending beyond housekeeping into character. That was an enormous burden to place on domestic life, especially given how dependent domestic order remained on money, health, servant labor, and luck. Servant relations themselves were shifting subtly. Domestic service remained one of the largest forms of employment for women, but the emotional and practical balance of service was never simple. Employers expected deference, efficiency, honesty, invisibility when required, and almost intimate attentiveness when convenient. Servants expected wages, food, references, and a tolerable household. But expectations on both sides could clash. Mistresses complained of impertinence, carelessness, or instability. Servants complained, sometimes only privately, of overwork, poor treatment, late wages, or impossible standards. The ideal of the smoothly functioning household depended on this relationship working well, yet it was often full of tension precisely because both sides lived so close to one another and yet occupied such unequal positions. For a maid-of-all-work in a small middle-class household, the day could be nearly unbroken labor. Lighting fires, carrying water, scrubbing floors, cleaning grates, helping with meals, running errands, answering the door, emptying chambers, washing, ironing, and remaining alert to rebuke. In grander houses, duties were more divided, but hierarchy was sharper. Below stairs there existed an entire social order with ranks, ambitions, resentments, alliances, and codes of dignity. Servants did not simply support Regency life from outside. They inhabited it fully, though from a different angle, one that exposed its dependence on hidden labor more clearly than any polished memoir could. If we shift again from the home to the body, another continuity appears. Physical discomfort remained ordinary. Medical knowledge advanced in some areas, but for everyday people pain was still woven into life with a familiarity modern audiences can find difficult to imagine. Dental suffering, chronic digestive complaints, bad eyesight, untreated injuries, joint pain, women's reproductive illnesses, infections, childhood diseases, all continued to shape the rhythm of families. The home was not only a site of comfort and display. It was a place where sickness was nursed, watched, guessed at, and often feared. Beds were not always restful places. They were also places of confinement, childbirth, fever, and not infrequently death. This persistent presence of illness altered emotional habits. Families learned to live with uncertainty. A child with a cough could trigger real anxiety. A fever in the house might reorganize the whole day. A mother exhausted after repeated pregnancies might have no vocabulary for her condition beyond weakness, nerves, or decline. An older relation could become a permanent object of care. Domestic life was therefore more medically charged than its refined image suggests. A household could move within hours from social planning to crisis management, and often with little distinction between amateur care, folk wisdom, and formal medical advice. Children growing up in this environment learned early that life was not wholly protected. They saw illness close at hand, witnessed sibling deaths more often than later generations, heard adult conversations about money, and participated in household labor according to class. Even privileged children, who enjoyed nursery routines and tutors, lived in a world where physical frailty was visible and emotional discipline expected. Childhood innocence existed, but not in the sealed modern sense. Children inhabited the same material world as adults. Cold mornings, imperfect sanitation, limited privacy, and a social order that watched and trained them from the beginning. Education remained one of the main ways families tried to negotiate uncertainty. To educate a son was to hope he might sustain or elevate the family. To educate a daughter was to make her marriageable, useful, or perhaps employable in narrow ways if necessity required it. Governesses occupy a particularly poignant place here. Often genteel but financially vulnerable, they stood in the strange middle ground between family and servant, entrusted with the minds and manners of children while lacking the security or intimacy of either full status. Their daily life could be lonely, disciplined, and emotionally awkward, one of the clearest examples of how Regency society generated roles that were respectable in theory and quietly painful in practice. That quiet pain is one of the most important features of everyday life in the period. Not dramatic tragedy, but sustained awkwardness. The dependent relation who stays too long. The unmarried aunt who has kindness but little authority. The son who should have prospects but does not. The widow who must economize delicately enough that others do not notice too much. The curate on a tiny income trying to maintain the standards expected of a gentleman. The merchant's wife anxious that money may purchase luxury but not full acceptance. So much of the era's psychological texture lies in these positions of partial belonging. And yet the period's appetite for elegance did not disappear under that strain. If anything, refinement became more precious because it offered one of the few ways to impose shape on uncertainty. Good manners, orderly meals, proper dress, polished silver, music after dinner, a card left at the right hour, all these were forms of reassurance. They did not solve structural inequality or domestic sorrow, but they gave life pattern. This is one of the reasons the Regency still exerts such fascination. Its beauty was not merely decorative. It was often defensive. People cultivated grace because the world around that grace was rougher than the image allowed. There is a small but telling irony here. The more we understand the period honestly, the less trivial its rituals begin to seem. The teacup, the visiting card, the carefully lit room, the properly folded note, the polished boot, the well-managed dinner. These are no longer empty symbols of elegance. They become tools for moving through a world of discomfort, scrutiny, and unequal dependency. The era's famous surfaces begin to look less like vanity and more like social technology. Not harmless, certainly, often exclusionary, sometimes cruel, but still practical in their own historical context. At the same time, the cracks were widening. Economic pressures remained. Reform debates would return with greater force. Industrial growth would continue to rearrange lives. The countryside would not remain untouched by change, nor would the old landed elite remain unchallenged forever. Even family life, so often treated as timeless, was beginning to be discussed and imagined differently through religion, literature, medicine, and moral reform. The home was becoming more emotionally idealized at the very moment it remained materially hard work. That contradiction would shape much of the decades ahead. If we stay for a moment in the late Regency and its immediate aftermath, the world still feels suspended between old and new. Coaches still move through mud, though new transport futures are beginning to stir. Servants still carry hot water and light fires before dawn. Gentlemen still worry over credit, wives over household economy, laborers over bread, daughters over prospects, and magistrates over crowds. The king may be George IV now, but the deeper structures of daily life retain their old weight. And because they retain it, we can see more clearly that what later generations remembered as Regency elegance was never a complete social truth. It was a bright band across a much more uneven landscape. That landscape included empire, too, even when ordinary English life seemed local and inward-looking. Tea, sugar, cotton, naval pay, military careers, colonial trade, imported goods, and the language of British power were woven into daily habits. A breakfast table in England could be set with the produce of distant labor. A family's fortunes might depend on colonial appointments or naval service. Fashion itself could be touched by fabrics and objects from far beyond Britain. Yet empire often remained abstract for those benefiting from it most directly. It appeared as comfort, taste, opportunity, and national pride long before it appeared as coercion or extraction. This quiet presence of empire inside everyday domestic routines is one of the era's deepest hidden structures. The same might be said of law. Much of ordinary life moved under legal assumptions few people actively discussed each day but many felt. Inheritance rules shaped where families lived and who expected security. Marriage law shaped women's futures. Settlement laws affected mobility for the poor. Debt law threatened imprisonment. Employment relations, tenancy, apprenticeship, guardianship, all rested on legal frameworks that could enter life abruptly in moments of conflict. The Regency was a highly social world, but it was also a highly legal one. Custom mattered, yet custom sat inside institutions that could be stern and impersonal when needed. This is especially apparent in the world of debt. Credit allowed lives to look smoother than their finances warranted, but when credit failed, the consequences could be devastating. The fear of the debtor's prison was not theatrical. It belonged to the practical imagination of the age. Families could be ruined not only by extravagance but by misfortune, delay, overconfidence, or an unwise alliance. Debt therefore hovered in the background of many respectable lives as a kind of moral weather. One might not speak of it openly, but it shaped tone, temper, and possibility. To be solvent was not merely to have money. It was to have room to breathe. And breath, in a sense, is what so many people in Regency England were trying to secure. A little more room, a little more warmth, a little more status, a little less scrutiny, a little less dependence, a little more certainty for children, a little relief from the endless need to maintain appearances, stretch income, watch conduct, or fear decline. Whether rich or poor, though in radically unequal measure, people were often negotiating pressure rather than resting in ease. The forms of the pressure differed, but pressure was everywhere. Perhaps that is why the period's quieter pleasures feel so meaningful when seen properly. Tea shared in confidence. A fire that burns well on a damp evening. A letter from someone genuinely loved. A horse ride in clear weather. A well-cooked meal. A child recovered from illness. An invitation one hoped for arriving at last. A debt met in time. A servant who stays. A neighbor who proves kind. These do not sound like the grand ornaments of history, but they were the lived victories of everyday life. They are also part of what gave the age its emotional depth. And once we take those small victories seriously, another part of Regency England becomes easier to understand: the persistence of hope. People hoped through uncertainty with remarkable stubbornness. They hoped for marriages, promotions, inheritances, recoveries, reforms, better seasons, kinder patrons, improved wages, healthy children, gentler weather, respectable futures. Hope could be prudent or delusional, tender or calculating, but it kept households moving. Even the most mannered and constrained corners of the age were full of people trying to imagine a tolerable future from within imperfect conditions. That is where the documentary naturally needs to go next, because hope in Regency England was never free-floating. It attached itself to marriage, to property, to work, to mobility, to reform, to the changing shape of the nation itself. And once we follow those hopes closely, we begin to see how everyday life in this supposedly graceful age was always leaning toward an uncertain tomorrow, one that was already beginning to redraw the world people thought they knew. And once we follow those hopes closely, we begin to see how everyday life in this supposedly graceful age was always leaning toward an uncertain tomorrow, one that was already beginning to redraw the world people thought they knew. Hope in Regency England was rarely abstract. It attached itself to things that could be counted, inherited, earned, introduced, or endured. A family hoped a son might secure a living in the church, a commission in the army, a post through patronage, or success at the bar. They hoped a daughter might marry a man kind enough, solvent enough, and sensible enough to make her future safer than her present. Laborers hoped wages might hold through winter. Shopkeepers hoped credit would extend 1 month more. Servants hoped for good references, better places, kinder employers. Hope, in other words, was threaded directly into the practical machinery of life. This is one reason property mattered so deeply. To modern listeners, the period's preoccupation with inheritances, settlements, dowries, leases, and estates can seem overly legal, even emotionally cold. But for people living through it, property was not a dry category. It was stability made visible. A secure income, a house held on reliable terms, land producing steady returns. These things shaped not just comfort but personality itself. They could soften tempers, widen choice, and make generosity easier. Their absence did the opposite. One of the clearest truths about Regency everyday life is that emotional atmosphere often followed economics more closely than manners admitted. The house naturally stood at the center of these hopes, not merely as a building but as a total environment. To secure a house, keep a house, improve a house, or move from one house to another was to alter the rhythm of daily existence. A larger house implied more status, more room, perhaps more servants, but also more expense, more responsibility, and more exposure if income failed. A smaller house could mean humiliating retrenchment or welcome simplicity, depending on the story being told about it. People measured one another by where they lived and how they kept it, but they also measured themselves. A household's moral confidence could rise or fall with its domestic setting. This makes moving house a more significant event than it may first appear. A change of address in Regency England was not just logistical inconvenience. It could alter social standing, social reach, daily routes, servant arrangements, educational choices for children, parish ties, and the invisible emotional map of a family's life. To leave a larger house for a smaller one, or London for the country, or a town center for a marginal location, might feel like decline even if it was prudence. To move upward could feel precarious too, because one had to keep pace with the standards implied by the new surroundings. Every improvement carried expectation. Among the middling ranks especially, the period was full of people trying to stabilize their future through careful respectability. This is one of the least showy but most characteristic features of the age. not aristocratic magnificence, not the outright desperation of the very poor, but the disciplined effort of families living between those extremes. They budgeted. They delayed purchases. They cultivated connections. They educated children for utility as much as accomplishment. They hoped to climb a little, or at least not to fall. Their lives could look orderly from a distance while being held together by calculation so constant it became almost a habit of mind. For women, these hopes were often structured by marriage, but not only by marriage. Some women hoped for a secure settlement. Some hoped simply not to be a burden to brothers or cousins. Some hoped to maintain a degree of dignity as widows. Others hoped, in quieter and harder ways, to find work that did not entirely erase their gentility. The governess, the companion, the schoolmistress, the milliner, the dressmaker, each occupied different social ground, but all show how narrow the corridor of female independence could be. To earn money and remain respectable was possible. To do so comfortably was much rarer. There is a temptation to tell this as a story of frustration alone, but that would not be fully true. Many women exercised intelligence and influence within the spaces available to them. They managed households with formidable skill. They directed servants, stretched resources, maintained kin networks, advised children, shaped hospitality, and often served as the practical memory of the family, remembering accounts, obligations, birthdays, resentments, and opportunities others forgot. In some homes, especially where men were absent, weak, careless, or often away, women effectively held the structure together. The irony is that a society which formally limited their power depended heavily on their competence. Men, meanwhile, lived under a different but equally revealing form of hope: the hope of adequacy. A gentleman was expected to possess self-command, judgment, and enough income to support the style of life his rank implied. A professional man was expected to advance. A tradesman was expected to sustain reputation and solvency. Even a laborer was expected to embody industry, sobriety, and independence if at all possible. Masculinity in Regency England could look confident on the surface, but beneath it lay continual tests. Was a man earning enough? Governing himself enough? Drinking too much? Gambling? Spending beyond reason? Failing to direct his household? The age judged men not only by outward success, but by their ability to appear deserving of authority. The word deserving matters here because it reveals how moralist the social order was. Poverty, dependence, extravagance, and idleness were rarely treated as purely neutral conditions. They attracted explanation and judgment. A struggling family might receive sympathy, but also scrutiny. Was their hardship caused by illness, bad luck, the market, or imprudence? Had they lived too high? Had they failed to discipline children? Had they maintained standards or let them slip? Regency England was not content simply to observe circumstances. It interpreted them morally, often with considerable confidence and not always with fairness. This moral scrutiny extended into the language of improvement. Improvement was one of the age's favorite ideas. People spoke of improving land, improving roads, improving minds, improving morals, improving domestic arrangements, improving taste. The word sounded hopeful and forward-looking, and often it was. Roads were better in many areas than they had once been. Agricultural methods changed. Towns expanded. Education spread unevenly but more widely. Consumer goods multiplied. Yet improvement had a shadow side. Could mean enclosure. Could mean displacement. It could mean pressure to conform to standards set by others. It could mean measuring life constantly against what it ought to become rather than what it was. That shadow side shows itself beautifully in the rise of domestic advice literature and conduct writing. The period produced a steady stream of prescriptions on manners, housekeeping, female behavior, child-rearing, religion, And all of this unfolded within an England that was becoming more mobile, even before the railway age fully transformed movement. Better roads, coaching networks, postal improvements, and expanding commercial links meant people, goods, and information traveled with increasing speed by the standards of the time. That mobility mattered emotionally. It widened the range of imaginable futures. A young man might go to London, to a naval port, to a colonial post, to a different county. A family might relocate for economy, health, or ambition. A daughter might marry into another region altogether. The world remained difficult to traverse, but not immovably closed. Possibility existed, and possibility itself could be unsettling. Because once people begin imagining different futures, ordinary life grows harder to accept as fixed. This is one of the subtle changes taking place in the late Regency and its aftermath. Earlier hierarchies remained strong, but more people could now compare themselves across wider distances, literally and socially. They saw new fashions, new fortunes, new urban expansions, new forms of commerce, and new kinds of aspiration. The old village or parish world did not disappear, but it no longer enclosed imagination quite so completely. A servant hearing of opportunities elsewhere, an apprentice in a growing town, a merchant's son reading about trade, a clergyman's daughter seeing urban society, all might feel the tug of a life larger than the one immediately inherited. Economy and taste. These texts were meant to guide, but they also reveal anxiety. People did not need so much instruction unless they were unsure whether they were managing correctly. Advice books promised order. They also quietly told readers that order was precarious. The house might slip. The servant might become lax. The daughter might be too bold. The son might be too idle. The budget might fail. The soup might be poor. The curtains might be wrong. Self-improvement, like so much else in the Regency, offered reassurance while intensifying pressure. And all of this unfolded within an England that was becoming more mobile, even before the railway age fully transformed movement. Better roads, coaching networks, postal improvements, and expanding commercial links meant people, goods, and information traveled with increasing speed by the standards of the time. That mobility mattered emotionally. It widened the range of imaginable futures. A young man might go to London, to a naval port, to a colonial post, to a different county. A family might relocate for economy, health, or ambition. A daughter might marry into another region altogether. The world remained difficult to traverse, but not immovably closed. Possibility existed, and possibility itself could be unsettling. Because once people begin imagining different futures, ordinary life grows harder to accept as fixed. This is one of the subtle changes taking place in the late Regency and its aftermath. Earlier hierarchies remained strong, but more people could now compare themselves across wider distances, literally and socially. They saw new fashions, new fortunes, new urban expansions, new forms of commerce, and new kinds of aspiration. The old village or parish world did not disappear, but it no longer enclosed imagination quite so completely. A servant hearing of opportunities elsewhere, an apprentice in a growing town, a merchant's son reading about trade, a clergyman's daughter seeing urban society, all might feel the tug of a life larger than the one immediately inherited. At the same time, larger futures were dangerous precisely because they could disappoint. The city swallowed money. Colonial prospects could vanish. Marriage hopes failed. Professions filled slowly. Patronage was uncertain. Families who invested emotionally in one path could find themselves forced into another. This is why so much Regency life carries an undertone of waiting. Waiting for letters. Waiting for an uncle to recover or die. Waiting for a living to fall vacant. Waiting for a proposal. Waiting for prices to ease. Waiting for a commission, a legacy, a child, a tenant, a settlement. Time itself felt weighted because outcomes depended on so many delays beyond personal control. That waiting shaped the experience of youth especially. To be young in Regency England was often to live in suspended preparation. Boys were prepared for school, profession, or inheritance. Girls were prepared for social appearance, household usefulness, and the possibility of marriage. Neither sex, in respectable circles, enjoyed what modern people might call open-ended self-discovery. Young people were watched, trained, judged, and often kept in a state of dependence for longer than their emotional lives could easily bear. Energy had to be channeled into acceptable forms. Restlessness had to be governed. Ambition had to fit a script. That is one reason small moments of freedom, a ride unchaperoned, a private letter, a walk, an invitation to travel, could feel disproportionately vivid. If we turn from youth to age, another layer appears. Regency England was not only full of beginnings, it was full of people carrying old disappointments forward. Widows, widowers, aging unmarried siblings, retired officers, elderly relations living on annuities, parents seeing children established or failing to establish, all belong to the ordinary fabric of households. The aging body and the aging income were both important facts. A family might not be ruined dramatically. It might simply narrow year by year under the weight of growing infirmity and insufficient money. Old age could bring authority and comfort in fortunate homes. In others it brought dependence and the quiet indignity of feeling oneself increasingly inconvenient. The emotional tone of these later life households often depended on interdependence managed well or badly. A generous daughter caring for an aging parent might feel real affection and real entrapment at once. An elderly aunt maintained by relatives might be grateful and also painfully aware of her diminished place. A son supporting family members might do so dutifully and resentfully. Regency domestic life was rich in these mixed emotions because so few people could afford complete independence. Families remained economically entangled, and affection did not dissolve the strain. This entanglement becomes especially clear when death enters the story, as it so often did. Death did not arrive only as private grief. It rearranged property, household composition, authority, and expectation. A father's death might make a son master, leave a widow dependent on arrangements already made, alter the marriage prospects of daughters, and force decisions about moving, retrenching, or dividing responsibilities. A child's death might devastate emotionally while also changing inheritance lines. Even mourning clothes and funeral customs required expenditure. The practical and the emotional could not be separated. Bereavement was lived through accounts as well as tears. That does not mean the period was emotionally stunted. Quite the reverse. People often felt with great force, but they felt inside a framework where consequence followed feeling rapidly. Love led to marriage negotiations. Grief led to legal business. Illness led to hiring help or dismissing it. Failure led to retrenchment. Success led to social exposure. This is perhaps why the era's most polished manners could coexist with such inward tension. The stakes attached to ordinary decisions were simply higher than the smoothness of the language suggested. And meanwhile, outside the walls of individual homes, broader changes kept moving. Reform did not disappear after repression. Industrial development kept altering landscapes and labor. Urban populations grew. Religious energies shifted. Imperial connections deepened. Consumer habits widened. Printed matter proliferated. England was becoming denser with information, goods, and argument. A person could still live locally, but no longer entirely locally. This growing density changed everyday consciousness. More voices, more examples, more standards, more warnings, more temptations, more ways to imagine that life might be otherwise. One can see this clearly in the changing idea of comfort. Comfort is one of those deceptively simple words that reveals a great deal. For a laboring family, comfort might mean enough bread, fuel, dry bedding, a pair of shoes not yet broken through, and relief from immediate fear. For a middling household, comfort might mean a servant or two, decent meals, proper linen, a carriage hired when necessary, and freedom from humiliating economies. For the affluent, comfort could include rooms warmed in multiple parts of the house, steady service, fashionable furniture, fresh foods out of season, travel, leisure, and medical attendance. What counted as comfort varied, but across classes there was a growing awareness that comfort itself could be improved, bought, compared, and displayed. That awareness changed daily feeling. Once comfort becomes something visible in others, one's own discomfort can feel sharper. The servant sees the mistress's tea equipage. The governess sees the family's ease but not its emotional cost. The merchant's wife sees the landed lady's inherited assurance. The laborer sees the farmer's table. Comparison existed in every age, but the Regency's expanding commercial culture made it more immediate. Goods, styles, and habits circulated. People saw more of what they lacked. Hope and dissatisfaction grew together. And still, for all that, the age never became entirely modern in its inner tempo. The pace remained slower in a bodily sense. Water still had to be drawn. Fires still had to be laid. Linen still had to be washed by hand. Journeys still consumed hours or days. Darkness still altered evening life. News still had to travel physically. This combination, widening aspiration inside slow material routines, is part of what gives Regency everyday life its distinctive tension. Minds could begin to move faster than conditions. People could imagine improvement before they could fully inhabit it. That is why the period feels so often poised between composure and restlessness. The old forms of deference, politeness, and household order still held impressive power. But behind them were more ambitious consumers, more anxious parents, more frustrated workers, more mobile young people, more visible inequalities, and more public conversation than the older social language could comfortably contain. The Regency, seen honestly, was not a static age of elegance. It was a transitional world trying to look more settled than it really was. And in that unsettled quality, the smallest routines become unexpectedly revealing. Who answered the door? Who wrote the letters? Who kept the accounts? Who poured the tea? Who mended the cuffs? Who chose not to heat an extra room? Who sold a horse? Who dismissed a servant quietly to save money? Who borrowed books instead of buying them? Who extended a visit because home felt too bleak? Who hurried a daughter into company while she was still young enough to attract notice? Who pretended confidence over an uncertain dinner table? These are the details through which history becomes intimate, because everyday life in Regency England was made not only of grand structures, class, war, reform, empire, law, but of these tiny negotiations repeated until they became a life. And once we have seen how much pressure, strategy, hope, and compromise were hidden inside the ordinary, another side of the story comes into view as well. The very different realities of those who served, labored, and endured beneath the genteel image more directly, and whose daily world was harsher, more physical, and less forgiving than the Regency myth usually allows, and whose daily world was harsher, more physical, and less forgiving than the Regency myth usually allows. If there is a final truth to take from all of this, it may be that everyday life in Regency England was neither the dream of elegance later nostalgia preferred, nor the simple catalogue of misery that modern correction sometimes substitutes in its place. It was more human than either version. It was a world in which beauty and discomfort lived very close together. Candlelight could be lovely and also dim. A ball could be thrilling and also exhausting. A fine house could impress and still be cold in the corridor. Good manners could soften life, but they could also conceal fear, dependence, and disappointment. The age was graceful in parts because so much effort went into holding grace against reality. That is perhaps why the period endures in the imagination. Not because it was easy to live in, but because its surfaces were so carefully made. Beneath those surfaces were people doing what people in every age do. Trying to keep warm, trying to remain respectable, trying to secure the future of children, trying to endure illness, trying to stretch money, trying to read one another correctly, trying to find affection without disaster, comfort without ruin, beauty without too much self-deception. Once we see that, Regency England becomes less a costume and more a lived world. The drawing room returns in the end, but it looks different now. The polished tea tray is still there. The visiting cards are still stacked neatly. The fire has been laid. The curtains are drawn against the evening. Somewhere upstairs, a servant is still working. Somewhere outside, the street is still muddy. Somewhere in the house, someone is worrying about money. Somewhere else, someone is hoping a letter will arrive tomorrow. A daughter is thinking about her prospects. A son is thinking about his future. A mother is counting expenses in her head. A father is trying not to show concern. The room is calm, but the calm has been made. And that, more than the gowns or the wit or the carefully orchestrated dinners, may be what everyday life was really like in Regency England. Not effortless elegance, but managed existence. A society trained to make difficulty look orderly. A world in transition, still carrying older hierarchies, yet already leaning toward newer forms of pressure, comparison, and change. The people who lived in it were not characters arranged for our pleasure. They were people negotiating systems they did not choose, using the tools they had: manners, labor, family, religion, money, clothing, letters, silence, resilience, to make life bearable and sometimes, in spite of everything, meaningful. If one detail from this world stayed with you most, or if there is one part of Regency life that feels hardest to imagine living through, I'd be genuinely interested to hear it. And if you'd like, do subscribe for more calm, thoughtful journeys into the past, because there are many more worlds like this still waiting for us.